Welcome, Night Seekers, to Netheric Horror. Tonight, true scary stories, gentle narration, and soothing rain await. Relax, close your eyes, embrace the darkness, and let your nightmare journey begin forever together. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Sweet dreams, if you can. My name is Edward, and I have been into urban exploration for years now. Abandoned factories, old tunnels, decommissioned hospitals. The usual list of places that people in this hobby tend to gravitate toward once they get serious about it. The kind of locations that show up over and over in the same online communities and forums where people like me swap tips, share footage, and trade recommendations for the next spot worth visiting. Most of these places carry some level of creepiness to them, sure, but it is almost always manageable. You walk in, you feel a bit uneasy for a while as your eyes adjust and your imagination starts filling in the gaps left by broken windows and empty hallways. You get whatever footage or photos you came for, and then you leave, carrying the whole experience with you as just another entry in a long list of strange, atmospheric places you have visited over the years. One more story to tell at the next gathering of people who share this particular hobby with you. A few months ago, though, my two friends and I decided to explore an abandoned psychiatric institute located just outside the city. And something about that particular place felt wrong from the very second we actually walked through the entrance. I do not mean wrong in the fun, haunted attraction sense, the kind of manufactured, spooky atmosphere you get from a seasonal attraction built specifically to give people a thrill for a few dollars at the door. I mean genuinely, deeply wrong. The kind of wrongness that your body seems to register before your conscious mind has even had a chance to catch up and explain why. A heaviness in the air the moment we crossed the threshold that none of us commented on out loud right away. Though I suspect all three of us were feeling some version of the same unease. At first, everything about the place seemed fairly ordinary, at least by the standards of abandoned buildings we had already explored plenty of times before. There was broken furniture scattered throughout different rooms, old patient files left behind and slowly decaying in stacks or scattered across the floor, empty hallways stretching out in every direction with peeling paint, and years of accumulated dust coating every surface. The kind of scene that has become almost routine to us after enough trips to similar locations over the years. Nothing about any of that struck us as especially unusual, given how many similar buildings we had already been through together as a group, and we moved through those first several rooms with our usual practice calm, cameras rolling, occasionally pointing things out to each other worth documenting more closely. Then, we came across a nurse's station somewhere on one of the lower floors. The kind of small administrative desk you would expect to find in a facility like that, complete with a wall of hooks where room keys had apparently once hung, presumably used by staff to keep track of which rooms were locked and which were accessible at any given time. A whole grid of little brass hooks with faded, handwritten labels, still legible beneath most of them. Most of those keys were still there, hanging exactly where they had presumably been left behind whenever the facility was finally abandoned for good. Decades of accumulated dust settled thick over every single one of them. But one key was missing entirely. Every single room's key was accounted for, except for the key to room 14. Its hook sitting there conspicuously bare against the wall, while every hook around it still held its original key. At the time, we mostly laughed it off, making a joke or two about horror movie tropes and how convenient it seemed that the one missing key would belong to the room with a number that carried its own vague, superstitious weight in a lot of cultures. Someone even joking that whoever was still living in room 14 clearly did not want visitors. We kept exploring after that, working our way steadily up through the building, floor by floor, documenting everything we came across along the way we always do on these trips. our nerves settling back into their usual comfortable rhythm as we moved from room to room without incident. Eventually, we made our way up to the third floor, which turned out to be the patient wing itself, a long stretch of individual rooms lining either side of a central hallway, the same kind of institutional layout you see repeated across so many of these old facilities. Most of these rooms had their doors standing open, easy enough to walk into and look around without any resistance, each one revealing roughly the same scene of decay and abandonment as the last. Room 14, however, was closed, its doors shut tight in a way that stood out immediately against the pattern of every other open door we had passed by up to that point. The only closed door in the entire stretch of hallway. The weirdest part of the whole encounter with that door was the handle itself. When I reached out and touched it, it felt warm, distinctly warm, in a way that made absolutely no sense given how cold and abandoned the rest of the building had felt the entire time we had been exploring it, the temperature inside dropping steadily the higher we climbed. It felt exactly like the kind of warmth you would expect from a door handle that someone else had recently touched themselves, their body heat still lingering on the metal. And I remember pulling my hand back for a second, genuinely startled by it, before forcing myself to grip it properly and actually turn it. We pushed the door open anyway, curiosity winning out over whatever hesitation that warm handle had briefly given us, and stepped inside. The room itself looked essentially empty at first glance. Stripped down the same way most of the other rooms we had already seen throughout the building had been just bare walls and an old, rusted bed frame sitting in the middle of the space, no mattress left on it, just the skeletal frame itself. But then I noticed something on the wall directly above where the bed was positioned. Hundreds of scratches had been carved deeply into the surface of that wall, an overwhelming number of individual marks covering a huge stretch of the plaster, layered so densely in places that the wall almost looked textured from a distance. At first, from a distance, I genuinely thought they might simply be tally marks, the kind of thing you would expect a patient to carve into a wall while counting days or hours during some long, isolated stretch of confinement. A grim but understandable habit for someone tracking time in a place like that. But once I actually stepped closer to get a proper look at the detail of what had actually been carved, I realized it was not simple tally marks at all. It was the exact same phrase, carved over and over again, an almost obsessive repetition covering that entire section of wall. Still here. Still here. Still here. The same two words repeated hundreds of times, carved deep enough into the plaster that they must have taken an enormous amount of time and effort to actually complete. Some of the letters overlapping each other where space had clearly run out, and the carving simply continued regardless. It was right at that exact moment, standing there staring at that wall covered in those repeated words, that we heard footsteps. They were coming from directly below us, on a floor we had already fully explored and checked through earlier during our walk through the building. A floor we knew for certain was empty because we had gone through every single room ourselves not even 20 minutes earlier. The footsteps were slow, heavy, and deliberate. Nothing at all like the light, hesitant footsteps of someone unsure of their surroundings. These sounded confident, purposeful, the kind of steady, unhurried walking you would expect from someone who knew exactly where they were and exactly where they were going, each footfall landing with a weight that carried clearly up through the stairwell to where we stood frozen in room 14. We rushed over to the stairwell to look down and see what was actually making that sound. And that was when we saw someone standing completely motionless on the landing below us. The figure was wearing what looked like an old, faded patient uniform, the kind of worn hospital gown or institutional clothing you might expect a long-term psychiatric patient to have been dressed in decades earlier, back when this facility was still actually operating. The fabric, hanging loose and colorless in the dim light filtering down from somewhere above. The figure was not moving at all, just standing there perfectly still on that landing, facing away from us as best any of us could tell in that first frozen instant of looking down, its head tilted very slightly toward the wall beside it. We did not wait around to figure out who or what that figure actually was. We got out of that building as fast as we possibly could, practically flying down whatever alternate route we could find that did not require passing directly by wherever that figure was standing, adrenaline completely overriding any of our usual careful, methodical approach to navigating through an unfamiliar abandoned structure. Later that same night, once we were all safely back home and had a chance to calm down enough to actually process everything that had happened, I sat down and reviewed the footage I had recorded throughout the entire exploration. The figure was still there in the video footage, exactly as we had seen it in person on that landing. But something about it did not match my own memory of the encounter. I distinctly remembered the figure facing away from us, toward the wall, motionless and seemingly unaware of our presence up on the floor above. In the footage, though, the figure was staring directly at the camera, directly at us. The entire time we had been standing there looking down at it, its head angled up toward the stairwell rather than turned toward the wall the way I could have sworn I had seen it in the moment itself. That discrepancy alone was unsettling enough on its own, but it has only gotten worse the more times I have gone back and reviewed that same footage since that night. Every single time I watch it again, I swear the figure appears to be positioned slightly closer than it was in the previous viewing, an almost imperceptible shift each time that I cannot fully convince myself is simply my imagination playing tricks on me after watching the same clip too many times in a row, though I have tried comparing timestamps and frame counts more than once just to reassure myself that nothing has actually changed in the file itself. I have not uploaded the full footage anywhere yet, despite how much content it could potentially provide for anyone interested in this kind of exploration content. The kind of clip that would probably get plenty of attention from other people in this community if I actually put it out there. Honestly, I do not fully know what I actually captured inside that building that day, and some part of me is genuinely hesitant to share it more widely until I have a better understanding of what exactly is going on with that footage and why it seems to keep changing every single time I look at it again. In the days since that exploration, I have gone back through my notes and tried to find whatever historical records I could about that particular institute, hoping that some documented history might shed light on what we actually encountered that day. I found bits and pieces here and there, old newspaper archives, a handful of forum posts from other urban explorers who had apparently visited the same building years before us, but nothing that specifically addressed Room 14 or any patient who might have been kept there. No names, no dates, nothing concrete enough to actually connect to what we found carved into that wall. It is entirely possible that whatever happened in that room, whoever carved those words into the wall so many times, was never properly documented at all, lost somewhere in whatever incomplete records survived the facility's eventual closure and abandonment decades ago. My two friends who were there with me that day have both told me, separately and without any prompting from me, that they still think about that encounter more than almost anything else we have experienced together during years of doing this hobby. Neither of them has expressed much interest in ever going back to that particular building again, a rare reaction from either of them, given how eager they usually are to revisit especially interesting locations for additional footage, or a second look at something we might have missed the first time through. I keep coming back to that missing key in my own mind, turning it over constantly whenever I think about that whole day, unable to fully let go of just how deliberately absent it seemed compared to everything else on that wall of hooks. Every other room in that entire facility still had its key hanging exactly where it should have been. Undisturbed for who knows how many years since the building was actually abandoned. Only room 14's key was missing. The one room that, as it turned out, held that wall covered in the same two words carved over and over again. I do not know what happened to that key. Whether someone removed it deliberately at some point for reasons that have nothing at all to do with whatever we experienced, or whether its absence actually meant something more significant tied directly to whatever left those markings and whatever we ended up seeing standing on that landing below us. The warmth of that door handle has also never stopped bothering me since that day. A small physical detail that somehow unsettles me more than almost anything else we found in that entire building. Every other surface in that building, every railing, every doorknob, every wall we touched throughout the entire exploration had been exactly as cold as you would expect from a building that had been sitting abandoned and unheated for years, decades in some parts of it, based on how deteriorated everything looked. That one handle on that one door, leading into that one room with all of those carved words, was warm, and I have never been able to come up with any explanation for that detail that actually satisfies me. No matter how many times I try to walk through the possibilities in my head, running through every mundane cause I can think of, and finding none of them convincing enough to actually put the question to rest. I have thought, more than once, about whether I should actually go back to that building myself, alone this time, specifically to try room 14 again and see whether anything about it has changed since that first visit, whether the scratches are still there, whether the room still feels the same way it did that day. Every time I seriously consider it, though, I think about that footage. The way the figure's position seems to shift slightly closer every single time I watch it. And I find myself losing whatever nerve I had built up to actually follow through on the idea. I have also wondered whether the figure we saw that day was connected in some way to whoever carved those words into the wall, whether it might have been the same person, still present in that building in some form decades, after presumably having been a patient there, still repeating that same insistence. Still here, still here. An assertion of continued presence carved so many times into that wall that it started to feel less like a message meant for anyone else, and more like something the person carving it needed to convince themselves of, over and over, through whatever isolation or confinement had originally led them to start carving in the first place. I do not know what we actually encountered in that building that day, and at this point, I am not sure I want to know for certain. Part of me remains committed to the idea of continuing this hobby the way I always have, treating each new location as simply another interesting, atmospheric place worth documenting and exploring carefully. But another part of me has genuinely reconsidered how comfortable I am pushing forward into locked rooms or unexplained details the way I used to without a second thought. Given everything that happened in that one particular room, in that one particular building, on that one particular day. For now, the footage sits unreviewed by anyone outside my small circle of friends who were actually there that day, saved on a drive I have not touched again since the last time I convinced myself to sit through it and watch that figure's position shift, however slightly, closer than it had been the time before. I do not know if I will ever work up the nerve to share it more widely, or to go back to that building and see room 14 for myself one more time. For now, all I have is the memory of that warm door handle, that wall covered in the same two words repeated hundreds of times, and that motionless figure standing on the landing below us, staring, according to the footage at least, directly at us the entire time, even though I remember with complete certainty that it had been facing the wall. It was late at night, and everyone in our two-story house was asleep. There were 4 of us in total staying there at the time. My mom, who is bedbound and unable to get around on her own, my brother, my brother's girlfriend, and myself. The house was quiet, the way houses get well past midnight. Everyone settled into their own rooms. Nothing unusual going on, as far as I knew when I first drifted off to sleep that night. The whole house wrapped in that particular stillness that settles over a home once every single person inside it has finally gone to bed. I woke up suddenly to the sound of my dog screaming. The specific kind of high-pitched, almost human-sounding scream that Shiba Inus are known for making when something has genuinely alarmed them. A sound completely different from his normal bark, and one that always makes the hair on the back of my own neck stand up whenever I hear it. He only makes that particular sound when something is seriously wrong, and in this case, it was clear he was reacting to someone being at the front door. Our screen door out front is a little loose, made of wood, and it will sometimes rattle or make noise on its own whenever the wind picks up outside. A familiar little rattle that has become such an ordinary part of stormy nights that none of us usually even register it consciously anymore. I have heard that particular noise plenty of times before, enough that I usually would not think twice about it. But this time was different. Someone was clearly moving the door itself, and it was not the kind of erratic, random banging you would expect from wind. It sounded deliberate, like someone was working the space between the lock and the door frame, pulling the handle out and then letting it go so that it thudded back against the frame, over and over, in a slow, methodical rhythm, nothing about the pacing of it matching the gusting, inconsistent way wind usually moves that door. As I was getting myself out of bed to go check on what was happening, I heard the doorbell start ringing. It rang once, then again, then began ringing faster and faster, the gaps between each ring shrinking until, by the time I actually managed to get my bedroom door open, it had become one continuous, unbroken sound rather than distinct individual rings, filling the whole downstairs with an insistent, unrelenting noise that made my stomach drop before I had even fully processed what I was hearing. I made my way slowly down the hallway toward the front door. Still half groggy from having just woken up, but fully alert, now given everything I was hearing, my heart already pounding by the time I reached the top of the stairs. My brother and his girlfriend came down the stairs from the 2nd floor at roughly the same time, clearly having been woken up by the same commotion, both of them looking just as alarmed and disoriented as I felt. Between the 3 of us, we turned on the lights and looked out through the front windows to see if we could spot anyone standing outside anywhere at all. There was nobody there. No one on the concrete slab in front of the entryway, no one anywhere on the driveway either. The space in front of our house was completely and totally empty. Nothing moving anywhere within view. I opened the front door myself at that point, wanting to check directly rather than just relying on what we could see through the windows, my hand steadier than I expected it to be given how loud my own heartbeat had become in my ears. The doorway itself was empty too. Nobody standing there, nobody visible anywhere nearby that any of us could make out in the dark. Just the cool night air and the persistent, unbroken sound of the doorbell still ringing somewhere behind us inside the house. The actual ringer box for our doorbell system was located in the downstairs hallway, so I went and opened it up to see what was going on with it directly, my hands not entirely steady as I unscrewed the little cover plate. It was ringing like absolutely mad, the sound coming steadily and loudly from inside the box itself, but when I actually looked at the wiring and the components inside, everything appeared completely normal. Nothing visibly broken or malfunctioning in any way that I could identify just by looking at it. No loose wires, no scorched connections, nothing at all that would explain what was happening. I pressed the doorbell button myself at that point, just to see what would happen, and it kept ringing exactly the same way it had been the entire time. But the moment I actually pushed the button, something happened with the connection. Some kind of brief interruption or glitch in the signal for just a moment. A tiny stutter in the ringing before it went right back to ringing continuously again exactly as before. As though whatever was causing it did not appreciate being interrupted even for that split second. The button itself was not physically stuck in any way. Nothing jammed or lodged against it that I could find. And eventually, I just had to disconnect the ringer completely in order to get the constant ringing to actually stop, pulling the wires loose with my own hands since nothing else seemed to be working. The doorbell worked completely fine again the very next day. Once I reconnected everything, and it continued working perfectly normally for 3 more full years after that incident. Never once acting up again in any similar way, functioning exactly the same as it had for years before that single strange night. As though whatever had caused all of that ringing had simply finished whatever it was doing and never felt the need to return again. On that same day, the same day the doorbell rang endlessly with nobody there and the dog screamed at an empty entryway, I happened to ask my brother about something I had noticed sitting out in the garage earlier. A detail I had almost forgotten about entirely until the strangeness of that night brought it back to mind. There was a box shaped exactly like a gun case sitting next to our big chest freezer, positioned right near the rear door that leads out of the garage. It was white and red in color, sealed shut with a zip tie, and it had a clear plastic handle with some kind of tag attached to it. The kind of tag that looked like it belonged to either an evidence marker or a police storage identification label. Though I honestly cannot remember the exact wording on it anymore all these years later, only that it had the kind of official, slightly bureaucratic look to it that made it very clearly not just an ordinary storage container someone had picked up from a sporting goods store. My brother told me that he had received a shotgun from a police station's evidence storage just earlier that same day. The very day all of this other strangeness had happened with the doorbell and the dog, a coincidence of timing neither of us had actually connected until that exact conversation. The police had been holding on to that particular gun because it had been used in a suicide. My brother happened to know the family of the person who had died, and apparently, that family did not want the gun kept anywhere inside their own home going forward, mainly because they had another son in the household who was also struggling with suicidal thoughts himself, and having that specific weapon anywhere nearby felt like an obvious and serious risk they were not willing to take, understandably wanting it out of their house entirely rather than risk it becoming a second tragedy for the same family. The very first question I asked my brother, once he explained all of this to me, was whether the gun had actually been cleaned before it was handed back over to him. He told me no, it had not been cleaned at all. It still had residue on it from what had happened, dried and clinging in small clumps to parts of the weapon. Exactly the way you would expect if nobody involved in the process had bothered to properly clean it up before releasing it out of evidence storage and back to whoever was arranging to take custody of it. A detail that made my stomach turn a little just hearing it described secondhand. My brother ended up opening that box himself the day after all of this had actually happened. The day after the doorbell rang endlessly and the dog screamed at nothing standing outside our door. He told me about actually opening it and seeing what was inside once I got home from work later that same day, describing it to me in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that somehow made the whole thing feel even heavier than if he had made a bigger deal out of it. I have thought about the timing of all of this constantly in the years since it happened. The fact that the doorbell rang endlessly, the dog screamed at an empty doorway, and that gun box sitting in our garage all seemed to be connected to each other by the exact same day, even though none of us had any idea at the time that the doorbell incident and the arrival of that box were even related to one another until I happened to ask my brother about it directly, purely out of idle curiosity rather than any sense that the two things might actually be linked. Looking back, it feels almost impossible now to separate the two events in my own memory. The ringing and the screaming and the empty doorway all tangled up permanently, with the image of that white and red box sitting quietly next to our freezer the entire time. As though the two halves of that single day were never really separate incidents at all, just two different faces of the exact same strange thing making itself known to our family in whatever way it could. I do not know what to make of any of it, honestly, even now. Was whatever caused that doorbell to ring endlessly somehow connected to that gun sitting out in our garage, still uncleaned, still carrying physical evidence of the tragedy it had been involved in? Was it connected to the person who had died, some kind of presence following the weapon itself from wherever it had been held in storage all the way to our house, making itself known the moment it actually arrived on our property? I genuinely do not have an answer to any of that, and I do not think I ever will. No matter how many times I have gone back over every detail, trying to find some thread that ties it all together neatly into something I could actually explain to someone else with confidence. What I do know is that our dog, who normally only reacts that strongly to something genuinely alarming happening right at our front door, screamed exactly the way he does when someone he does not know is standing right there, even though nobody at all was actually visible anywhere near the house once we all went and checked thoroughly from multiple angles, multiple times. And I know that our doorbell, a system that had worked completely normally for years before that night, and continued working completely normally for years afterward, simply malfunctioned in exactly that one specific, sustained way on that exact same day that gun arrived in our garage, ringing endlessly with no explanation, refusing to stop until I physically disconnected it myself. Something that has never happened before or since in all the years we lived in that house. I have talked about this whole incident with my brother a handful of times over the years since, sitting up late some nights just going back over it together, the same way we might revisit any other strange family memory that neither of us has ever fully made peace with, and neither of us has ever managed to land on any kind of satisfying explanation for it. He has always maintained that receiving the gun that day was simply a coincidence of timing, that these kinds of transfers from police evidence storage happen on whatever schedule the department itself decides, completely unrelated to anything else going on in our own house at the same time. And logically, I understand that reasoning completely. There is no reason to assume the timing of a police department releasing evidence back to a family has anything at all to do with a doorbell malfunctioning at our house on that same day, and I do not fault him for holding on to the more practical, mundane explanation. But logic has never quite been enough to fully settle my own unease about it, especially given how specifically unusual both incidents were on their own, let alone happening on the exact same day as each other. Doorbells do occasionally malfunction, sure, ringing oddly or getting stuck for one reason or another, but this was not simply an odd, brief glitch. This was a sustained, continuous ringing that persisted for a significant stretch of time, accompanied by a screen door that seemed to be manipulated deliberately by someone or something we could never actually locate, and a dog reacting with a level of genuine alarm that he reserves specifically for real, perceived threats rather than random environmental noise, a distinction I have come to trust in him over years of living together. I have wondered, more than once, whether the gun itself somehow carried some kind of lingering presence attached to it, some remnant of the tragedy it had been involved in that had traveled along with it from wherever it had been sitting in evidence storage all the way to our garage. I know how strange that sounds, attributing some kind of haunting or lingering energy to an inanimate object rather than to a specific location or a specific person, but the timing of everything that happened that day has never let me fully rule out that possibility in my own mind, no matter how much I try to apply more rational, mundane explanations to it instead, running through every practical alternative I can think of and never quite landing on one that fully satisfies me. I also think often about the family who originally owned that gun, the ones who specifically did not want it kept in their own home because of their surviving son's own struggles with suicidal thoughts. I never met them personally, and my brother has never shared many additional details about them beyond what he originally told me that day, but I do think about them sometimes, wondering how they were doing, wondering whether they ever felt anything unusual themselves in the time between the original tragedy and the moment the gun was finally removed from their custody entirely and transferred into evidence storage, wondering whether whatever we experienced that night was in any way a continuation of something that had already been happening around them for far longer than any of us realized. I hope, for their sake, that whatever it was that showed up at our door that night, if it really was connected to any of this at all, never once made its presence known to them the same way it apparently did to us, and that their remaining son has found whatever peace and support he needed in the years since. The unclean condition of that gun has also stayed with me all these years later, more than almost any other detail from that entire day. I understand, logically, that evidence gets released from police custody in whatever condition it happens to be in, and that cleaning it up before handing it back over is simply not part of the standard procedure in most cases. But knowing that logically has never made it any easier to actually process the fact that something so directly, physically tied to an actual death sat out in our own garage, completely unaltered from the state it had been in during the original tragedy, sitting there quietly next to our chest freezer for that entire day before my brother ever opened the box to look inside himself, close enough to where the rest of us walked past dozens of times without having any idea what was actually inside it. I do not know if I believe that the doorbell incident and the arrival of that gun were genuinely connected in any meaningful way, or whether it really was simply an unfortunate coincidence of timing that my own mind has spent years trying to weave into something more significant than it actually was. But I know what I heard that night: the dog's scream, the screen door being worked at deliberately by something we never located, the doorbell ringing faster and faster until it became one continuous, unbroken sound, and an empty doorway that stayed completely empty no matter how many times any of us checked it. And I know what I learned only hours later, that a gun used in a suicide had arrived at our house that very same day, sitting uncleaned in our garage the entire time all of that other strangeness was happening, just a room away. Whether those two things are actually related to each other or not, I have never been able to think about one without immediately thinking of the other ever since. The two memories permanently fused together in my mind, no matter how many years continue to pass between me and that particular night. I know I am about a year late in sharing this, but I wanted to tell this story anyway, since it comes from my own mom and something she experienced back during her high school years in the Philippines, sometime around the 2000s, well before she ever met my dad or had any idea that the two of them would eventually end up together and have me. Back when she was still just a teenage girl with no idea how much of her own life still lay ahead of her, no idea she would one day be telling this exact story to a child of her own. Back when my mom was still in high school, she had two close friends who had a habit of sneaking around and exploring dark, empty parts of the school campus whenever they got the chance. A kind of small, thrilling rebellion that felt exciting precisely because it involved slipping past the ordinary rules of the school without actually getting into any serious trouble. At least not the kind of trouble that would follow any of them for very long. These two friends were always looking for some kind of adventure or thrill, and at some point, they started begging my mom to join them on one of these little excursions specifically to go ghost hunting somewhere on school grounds. The same kind of pestering, half-joking invitation that eventually wears any reluctant friend down until agreeing simply feels easier than continuing to say no. My mom eventually agreed to tag along with them, even though it clearly was not something she was doing purely out of her own initiative, more going along with her friend's enthusiasm than anything she had been genuinely eager to try herself. The kind of thing you agree to mostly because your closest friends keep asking, and you do not want to be the one who stays behind while everyone else goes off without you. They ended up exploring the darker areas of the school grounds extremely early in the morning, right around 5:50, just 10 minutes before the school gates were actually set to open for the day at 6 o'clock. The whole plan hinging on that narrow, carefully timed window. This gave them a small window of time where the school grounds were still mostly dark and empty, before students and staff would have normally started arriving for the day, a kind of narrow gap in the schedule that made this whole plan possible in the first place, requiring all three of them to actually wake up early enough themselves to make it there on time. The three of them made their way into one particular building located behind the school's basketball court, a building that apparently had a reputation among students for being a good spot for exactly this kind of exploring. The sort of place with a lingering, half-whispered reputation among the student body even before anything genuinely strange had ever happened there, as far as any of them knew at the time. They went inside without bringing any flashlight along with them at all. As my mom explained it to me, the school simply never required students to carry flashlights around campus under normal circumstances. The only real exception being during earthquake drills, which, given that this was the Philippines, were a fairly regular and serious part of school safety procedures, given how earthquake-prone that part of the world can be. Outside of those specific drills, though, nobody carried flashlights as a matter of course, so heading into that dark building without one was simply how things were. Not any kind of special, added risk they had specifically chosen to take on. Just an ordinary consequence of sneaking around before the sun had fully come up. As they made their way further down the hallway inside that building, moving deeper into the darkness with each step, their eyes still struggling to adjust to the low early morning light filtering weakly through whatever windows lined the corridor, they suddenly saw something at the far end of the hallway. A single head, peeking around the corner, or the edge of a doorway at the opposite end from where they were standing, watching them from that distance. The hallway itself apparently seemed to stretch on endlessly in the dim light, making it hard to judge exactly how far away that head actually was, or how quickly anyone could reasonably close that distance. The darkness at the far end swallowing up any real sense of scale or perspective. One of my mom's two friends, apparently caught up in either curiosity or bravado in that moment, took about 5 steps closer toward that end of the hallway where the head had appeared, wanting to get a better look at whoever or whatever was watching them from down there, moving with the kind of cautious, deliberate steps you take when you are not entirely sure you actually want to see what you are walking toward, each footstep echoing faintly off the walls of that long, dim corridor. But before anything else could happen, all three of them suddenly heard a security guard yelling out at them from the opposite end of the hallway, the left side, catching them in the act of being somewhere they clearly were not supposed to be at that hour. Apparently, getting caught by the guards like this was a fairly usual outcome whenever students tried to pull off this kind of early morning exploring. The guards being used to intercepting curious kids trying to sneak around campus before the gates officially opened. In that same moment, right as the guard's voice rang out and startled all three of them, my mom turned back around to look toward that same spot at the far end of the hallway where the peeking head had been, her heart already racing from the sudden shout behind her. It was gone. Whatever had been watching them from that distance had completely vanished in the brief span of time it took for the guard to call out and for her to turn her head back to check, leaving nothing behind but the same long, empty stretch of dim hallway that had been there all along. By the time my mom actually made it back home later that day, the whole encounter clearly still weighing on her mind enough that she decided to look into it further despite the exhaustion of an already long school day. She sat down at her laptop and did a bit of her own research, trying to find out whether anything unusual had ever happened in that particular building or that specific hallway at the school. She eventually came across one link, some kind of article or forum post that claimed a girl had actually died in that exact hallway at some point in the past. According to what my mom found, this girl had been pushed onto a nearby staircase, and the resulting injury caused her head to start bleeding heavily and quickly. She never survived the injury, dying not long after whatever had happened to her on those stairs, the whole account leaving my mom staring at her laptop screen for a long while afterward, unable to fully process what she had just read in relation to what she had witnessed only hours earlier that same morning. The absolute worst part of this entire story, at least from my own perspective, hearing it now as her child, is that I ended up attending that exact same school myself years later, walking the same grounds, sitting in classrooms not far removed from wherever all of this had originally taken place. And even now, all these years after it originally happened to her, this whole experience still genuinely haunts my mom and both of her friends who were there with her that morning. The memory of that peeking head and everything they later learned about the girl who died in that same hallway never having fully faded for any of them. Growing up, I remember my mom telling this story to me more than once over the years, always with the same serious, slightly hushed tone she reserved specifically for this particular memory, different from how she told other, lighter stories from her own childhood or high school years, the kind of stories that usually came with laughter and exaggerated details for effect. She never treated it as some fun, exaggerated campfire tale meant purely to entertain or scare me for the sake of it. She always spoke about it like something that had genuinely happened to her, something she still thought about seriously even decades later. Long after she had grown up, gotten married, and had kids of her own, her voice always dropping just slightly whenever she got to the part about turning around and finding the head gone. I remember asking her, the first time she told me this story, whether she was certain about the details she had found in that old research she did afterward, whether the article or post she found was actually reliable, or just some story students at the school had made up and passed around over the years, the way these kinds of school legends often develop, growing more elaborate with every retelling until nobody could quite trace the story back to any original verifiable source. She told me she genuinely was not sure herself, that she had never been able to fully verify the account beyond that one single link she happened to come across that day, and that she never went looking for any further confirmation after that. Mostly, I think, because part of her did not actually want to know any more details than she already had, some instinct telling her that digging deeper would only make the whole memory harder to live with rather than easier. What has always struck me most about this story, hearing it from her directly over the years, is not necessarily the head peeking around the corner itself, unsettling as that image obviously is. It is the timing of everything that happened afterward. The fact that the head vanished in that exact same instant the guard's voice rang out and startled all three of them, as though whatever it actually was had been listening just as closely to their surroundings as they had been to theirs. Retreating the moment it sensed the risk of being caught or confronted directly by someone else entering the scene, almost as though it understood exactly what was happening around it in a way that felt uncomfortably deliberate rather than accidental. I also think about how casually the whole thing started. Three teenage girls sneaking into an empty building before school officially opened, purely for the thrill of it, the kind of small, low-stakes adventure countless students probably attempt at schools all over the world without anything genuinely unusual ever actually happening to them. My mom has told me that this was far from the first time she and her friends had gone exploring around campus like that, and that most of those earlier attempts had been completely uneventful. Nothing more than an excuse to feel a small rush of excitement before the school day properly began, sneaking around some empty classroom or storage area and coming away with nothing more than a funny story to tell later that afternoon. It was only that one specific morning, in that one specific building, in that one specific hallway, that anything actually happened that none of them have ever been able to fully explain. Attending that same school myself, years later, added an entirely different layer to how I have always thought about this story. I remember, during my own time there, occasionally passing by that same building behind the basketball court. Sometimes even walking through parts of that same hallway myself during ordinary school hours, surrounded by other students, teachers, all the normal daytime noise and activity of a functioning school, backpacks and chatter and the mundane rhythm of moving between classes, the whole space feeling nothing like the version my mom had described to me so many times. It never once felt unsettling to me personally during any of those ordinary daytime visits. Nothing about the space itself giving off any particular sense of wrongness the way you might expect if I had somehow inherited even a small piece of whatever sensitivity my mom and her friends apparently picked up on that early morning years before I was even born. But knowing what my mom had experienced there, and knowing the specific details she had found about a girl actually dying somewhere in that same hallway after being pushed down a nearby staircase, did change how I thought about that particular building whenever I happened to walk past it, or through it myself. A small flicker of unease crossing my mind every single time, even on the most ordinary, uneventful school day. I never told many of my own classmates about my mom's story, partly because I was not entirely sure how seriously to take it myself, and partly because it felt like something personal to my own family, rather than something I wanted circulating more widely among people at the school itself, passed around and exaggerated the way these kinds of stories tend to become once enough different people start retelling them. I have asked my mom, more than once over the years since she first told me this story, whether she ever considered going back to that same hallway again at any point, whether out of curiosity or some desire to finally settle the question of what she actually saw that morning. She has always told me no, absolutely not, that she has had no interest whatsoever in returning to that specific spot again under any circumstances, even decades removed from the original incident, and even with the practical, grounded personality she has always otherwise had throughout her adult life. Whatever she experienced that morning clearly left enough of a mark on her that she has never once felt tempted to revisit it directly, preferring instead to simply carry the memory with her rather than ever attempt to confront it again in person, content to leave that particular chapter of her school years exactly where it sits. Her two friends from that morning, as far as I understand from what my mom has told me over the years, feel exactly the same way. All three of them despite having gone their separate ways to some degree since finishing high school together, still occasionally bring up that particular morning whenever the three of them happen to get together and start reminiscing about their school years. And none of them has ever suggested, even jokingly, that they should go back and check out that hallway again together as adults. The way people sometimes half-jokingly propose revisiting an old scary story just to prove to themselves it was never that serious. It remains, as far as I can tell, one of the very few memories from that entire stretch of their lives that none of them have ever wanted to revisit directly, no matter how much time has passed since it originally happened. I think about the girl in that story sometimes, too. The one my mom read about in that old article or forum post all those years ago. Wondering what her actual name might have been. Wondering what her life had been like before whatever tragedy took place on that staircase. Wondering whether her own family ever fully understood what had actually happened to her, or whether the full details of that incident were ever properly resolved or explained at the time. My mom never found any further information beyond that single link she came across, and as far as I know, nobody in our family has ever tried to dig any deeper into the specifics since then, myself included, despite having spent years of my own life walking through the very same halls where all of this reportedly took place. Close enough, perhaps, to wherever that staircase actually stood, without ever knowing it. I do not know for certain whether what my mom and her friends actually saw that morning was genuinely connected to that girl's death, whether it really was some lingering trace of her still present in that same hallway all these years later, or whether the timing of everything, the head vanishing right as the guard called out. The story my mom later found about a death in that exact same location was simply an unsettling coincidence that got woven together into something more significant in the retelling over the years since. But I know that my mom has never once treated this story lightly, has never laughed it off the way people sometimes do with old ghost stories that have lost their edge with enough repetition over time, and has never shown any sign of wanting to revisit that hallway or that building again in all the years since it happened. Her tone always carrying the same quiet seriousness, no matter how many times I have asked her to tell it again. Knowing that I ended up attending that exact same school myself, walking through some of those very same hallways during my own years there, without ever experiencing anything remotely similar to what my mom went through, has always felt like its own small, strange thread connecting the two of us across the years, a shared piece of history tied to the exact same physical space, even though our own individual experiences of that space could not have been more different from each other. She lived through something there that still unsettles her decades later. I simply walked to class, day after day, year after year, entirely unaware of what those same hallways had apparently once held for the mother who raised me. This happened to me about 2 years ago, but I have never been able to fully forget it, even now, with that much time having passed since it actually took place. One night, at around 2 in the morning, I decided to head out to buy something from a nearby grocery store. One of those late-night errands that feels perfectly ordinary in the moment, but ends up sticking in your memory for entirely different reasons than you would ever expect going in. The kind of trip you make without a second thought, simply because you happen to run out of something and could not be bothered to wait until morning. When I got to the first grocery store I usually went to, I found it closed, the lights off and the doors locked, nobody around at all given how late it actually was, the parking lot completely empty, except for a single car parked near the far end that probably belonged to whoever had closed up earlier that night. I decided to walk a little further to another store instead, one located a bit further away from my usual spot, but still within a reasonable walking distance, figuring it was worth the extra few minutes if it meant I could actually get what I needed, instead of turning around empty-handed and coming back another time. As I made my way toward that second store, walking along streets that were mostly empty and quiet at that hour, nothing but the occasional distant hum of a car somewhere further off and my own footsteps echoing softly against the pavement, I noticed a woman standing off to the side, crying bitterly. She was wearing a simple white dress, nothing especially remarkable about the style of it, and her hair was completely disheveled, tangled and messy in a way that immediately struck me as unusual for someone simply out on the street at that time of night. Something about the intensity of her crying, combined with how disheveled she looked overall, made me feel like I should at least check whether she needed some kind of help. My own sense of basic decency overriding whatever hesitation I might normally feel approaching a stranger crying alone in the middle of the night. I approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her further given how distressed she already seemed, and asked whether she needed any assistance. She said yes, but then she started saying a series of strange things that I genuinely could not make sense of. Her words coming out in some kind of jumbled, disjointed way that did not form any coherent sentence or request I could actually respond to or act on. Her voice trembling and cracking between what almost sounded like separate, unconnected fragments of speech. Listening to her for those few moments, I found my first instinct was to assume she was simply unwell, mentally unstable in some way. Someone possibly wandering the streets in the middle of the night, dealing with some kind of personal crisis or breakdown that I had no real way of helping her through myself, especially standing alone with her on an empty street with nobody else around to assist, either of us. Given that assumption, and given how genuinely confusing and unsettling her words had sounded to me in that moment, I decided it was best to simply walk away from her rather than continue trying to engage further, figuring there was not much more I could realistically do to help someone in that state on my own, especially at that hour, with nobody else around to assist. I only walked a short distance away from where she had been standing, nothing more than a handful of steps, really, before something made me glance back in her direction. Some small instinct telling me to check on her one more time before continuing on my way. A nagging feeling I could not quite explain, even in the moment itself. When I looked back, though, she was simply gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. No trace of her having walked off in any particular direction. Nothing at all to explain how she could have vanished so completely and so quickly in the short amount of time it took me to walk that small distance away from her. It genuinely felt as though the earth itself had swallowed her up, leaving absolutely nothing behind to suggest she had ever actually been standing there at all. No discarded item, no lingering sound of footsteps retreating, nothing. I stood there for a moment afterward, completely stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The street where she had been standing offered no obvious hiding spots that I could immediately identify, no alleyways close enough or doorways deep enough that she could have ducked into and out of sight within those few seconds it took me to glance away, and then look back again. There was simply nowhere for her to have gone that quickly, and yet she was gone, as completely and thoroughly as if she had never been there in the first place. The whole stretch of sidewalk sitting there, empty and quiet, exactly as it had been before I had first noticed her. I continued on to the grocery store after that, though I will admit my mind was no longer fully focused on whatever errand had originally brought me out that late at night. I kept replaying the encounter over and over in my head as I walked the rest of the way, trying to piece together some kind of explanation that would actually make sense of what I had just witnessed. Had I simply misjudged the distance somehow, glancing back sooner than I thought, and missing some quick movement on her part that would have explained her sudden absence perfectly reasonably? Had there been some hidden alley or gap between buildings that I simply had not noticed in the dim streetlight, something she could have slipped into unnoticed while my attention was briefly elsewhere? I ran through every possible mundane explanation I could think of, and none of them ever quite satisfied me. Not fully. Not in a way that let me set the whole experience aside comfortably. My mind circling back to it again and again, even as I tried to focus on the ordinary task of actually finding what I had originally come out to buy. By the time I actually made it into the store and finished picking up whatever it was I had originally gone out to buy, I still could not shake the unsettled feeling that entire encounter had left me with. Moving through the aisles almost on autopilot, while some part of my brain kept replaying that image of her standing there. The specific image of her standing there crying so bitterly in that plain white dress with her hair so disheveled has stayed with me clearly ever since, refusing to fade the way so many other ordinary late-night memories from that same period of my life eventually have. I have thought about that encounter many times over the past 2 years, turning it over in my mind whenever it happens to resurface, usually triggered by something completely unrelated. A woman crying somewhere in public, a glimpse of white fabric out of the corner of my eye, anything that even loosely resembles some small piece of what I witnessed that night. Every time it comes back to me, I find myself running through the same handful of questions all over again, wondering who she actually was, wondering what those strange, jumbled words she had been trying to tell me might have actually meant if I had somehow understood them clearly, and wondering, more than anything else, what actually happened to her in those brief few seconds between when I looked away and when I looked back, a gap of time so short it barely seems possible for anything at all to have happened within it, let alone for a person to disappear entirely. I have wondered more than once, and quite often, whether I should have tried harder to understand what she was saying instead of simply assuming she was unwell and walking away from her the way I did. Even now, I sometimes feel a small twinge of guilt over that decision, wondering whether she had genuinely been in some kind of real, ordinary trouble that night. Someone who truly needed help, and who I simply failed to properly assist because her words did not immediately make sense to me in the moment. That guilt sits alongside the stranger. More unsettling possibility that she was never simply an ordinary woman in distress at all. That whatever I actually encountered that night defies any conventional explanation entirely. And honestly, I am not sure which of those two possibilities unsettles me more whenever I actually sit and think it through. I have told a handful of people about this experience since it happened, and the reactions I get tend to vary quite a bit depending on who I am talking to. Some people immediately assume there must be some simple, rational explanation I am somehow missing, that she must have ducked into some doorway or alley I simply did not notice in the dim lighting, or that I misjudged how much distance and time had actually passed between when I first saw her and when I looked back again. I understand why people default to that kind of explanation, and I do not blame them for it, since it is certainly the easier, more comfortable answer to accept, the kind of tidy resolution that lets a strange story stay strange for a moment and then quietly get filed away as nothing more than an unusual coincidence. But having actually lived through the experience myself, standing right there on that street in the middle of the night, I remain genuinely unconvinced that any purely mundane explanation fully accounts for how completely and instantly she disappeared. Other people I have told this story to have reacted quite differently, taking it far more seriously and offering their own theories about what I might have actually encountered that night. A few have suggested that what I saw might have been some kind of spirit or apparition, tied perhaps to some tragedy that had occurred in that specific area at some point in the past. A woman who had died under difficult or sorrowful circumstances and whose lingering presence occasionally manifests to people passing through that particular stretch of street late at night. I have no way of confirming or denying that particular theory myself, since I have never actually looked into the history of that specific area to see whether anything unusual or tragic might have happened there previously. But the theory itself does align disturbingly well with everything I actually witnessed that night. The crying, the disheveled appearance, the strange, incomprehensible words, and then the sudden, complete disappearance that defied any rational explanation I could come up with on my own. I think about the specific details of her appearance more than almost anything else whenever this memory resurfaces. The plain white dress in particular, standing out to me as a detail that has always carried a certain unsettling weight, given how frequently that specific combination. A woman in white appears across so many different cultures' ghost stories and local legends, almost as though it were some kind of universal archetype that different traditions independently arrived at over the centuries. I did not consciously think about that detail at the time I actually encountered her, too focused in the moment on simply trying to figure out whether she needed help. But looking back on it now, that detail alone has always struck me as significant, whether or not it actually means anything real about what I encountered that night. I have also thought quite a bit about the strange, jumbled words she was saying to me, wishing more than once that I had paid closer attention in the moment, trying harder to actually parse out what she was saying, instead of simply writing it off as the incoherent rambling of someone in some kind of mental distress. I genuinely cannot recall any specific words or phrases from what she said, only the overall impression that none of it formed anything resembling a clear, coherent sentence or request, which in hindsight feels like it might have been an important detail I simply failed to properly register or remember, given how quickly the whole encounter unfolded and how unsettled I already felt by the time I actually walked away from her, my mind already half convinced something was wrong even before she vanished completely. Even now, 2 years removed from that night, I still find myself occasionally taking a different route whenever I have a reason to walk anywhere near that particular street late at night. Some small, persistent unease still lingering whenever I think about passing directly through that same stretch of sidewalk again. My feet almost carrying me automatically down some alternate path, even when the original route would genuinely be more convenient and would save me several extra minutes of walking. I do not know for certain whether that avoidance is genuinely necessary or simply an overly cautious habit I have developed out of an experience I can never fully explain, but either way, I have never quite managed to shake it completely. And I am not sure I actually want to try. Some part of me quietly content to simply let that unease remain exactly where it is, rather than push myself to confront it head on. In the weeks that followed, I actually tried searching online a few times, looking through local news archives and neighborhood forums to see whether anyone else had ever reported anything similar happening along that same stretch of street, or whether there had been any documented incident in that general area involving a woman in a white dress. Anything at all that might help explain what I had witnessed that night. I did not find anything definitive, no clear match to what I had experienced, though I did come across a few scattered, vague posts on local community boards from people describing similarly unsettling encounters somewhere in that same general part of town. Nothing detailed or specific enough to feel like solid confirmation of anything concrete, but enough to make me wonder whether I was not the only person who had ever experienced something strange walking through that particular area late at night, alone, with nobody else around to witness it alongside them. I have also gone back on a few occasions since that night and tried to recall the exact spot where I first saw her, walking that same route during the daytime when everything felt ordinary and safe, sunlight bright overhead, and the street full of the usual daytime foot traffic, just to see whether anything about the location itself might explain what had happened. In the daylight, it looks exactly like any other unremarkable stretch of sidewalk. A stretch of storefronts, a parking lot. Nothing that would suggest any kind of history or significance tied to the spot. Nothing that would give any passerby reason to think twice about walking through it at any hour of the day or night. And yet, knowing what I experienced there that night, I have never been able to look at that same stretch of sidewalk in quite the same way again. Even under the most ordinary, sunlit conditions, some small part of me always half aware of what happened there, regardless of how normal everything around me actually looks in that moment. I think more than anything else, what has stayed with me the longest is simply the completeness of her disappearance. The fact that there was no gradual fading, no distant figure retreating into the darkness that I might have simply lost track of amid the shadows and the poor streetlight. She was there, fully visible, close enough that I could hear her voice clearly and see the details of her disheveled hair and her plain white dress. And then, within the span of only a handful of steps, she was not there at all, replaced by nothing but empty sidewalk and quiet, undisturbed air, as though the last several seconds had simply been erased and reset the moment I looked away from her, leaving no trace behind of anything having happened at all. That specific quality of the disappearance, so sudden, so total, so utterly lacking in any transitional moment I could point to and say, there, that is precisely when she actually left, is the detail that has always kept this memory from settling comfortably into any explanation I have ever tried to apply to it, no matter how many times I have gone back over the sequence of events in my own head. I do not know what I actually encountered that night, whether it truly was some kind of spirit or apparition, some ordinary woman experiencing a genuine crisis who happened to slip out of sight in a way I simply failed to properly track with my own eyes, or something else entirely that defies easy categorization either way. What I do know is that the memory of her, crying there in that plain white dress with her hair disheveled, speaking words I could never quite make sense of, and then vanishing so completely and so quickly that it genuinely felt as though the earth itself had swallowed her whole, has never once faded from my mind in all the time since it actually happened. And I suspect it never fully will, resurfacing every so often exactly as vivid and unresolved as it was the very first night it happened, no matter how many years continue to pass between me and that one strange encounter. I had just finished signing the lease contract for a share house, sitting down carefully with a realtor agent who was responsible for managing the property and going through all of the usual paperwork you deal with when moving into a new place with other housemates, initialing pages one by one and going over the terms of the agreement the same way anyone does when settling into a new rental situation. Everything about that process felt completely ordinary. Nothing about signing those papers giving me any indication whatsoever of what was about to happen only a few short hours later that very same day. No strange feeling in the house at all. No odd comment from the agent. Nothing at all that would have warned me something was seriously wrong with the place I had just committed to living in. About 3 hours after I had finished signing everything, the other bloke who already lived in that house told me he was heading out for an meeting that evening, leaving me alone in the house all by myself for the first time since I had actually moved my things in. I did not think much of it at the time, simply nodding along and letting him know I would be fine on my own while he was out, still getting used to the layout of my new living space, and generally just wandering around the house, getting a feel for the rooms and the general setup of the place I was now going to be calling home, checking out the kitchen, the bathroom, the small backyard, all the ordinary things you do when you first move somewhere new. At some point during this wandering, I decided to turn on the television in the living room. mostly just to have some background noise while I continued settling in. The sound of the show or whatever channel came up, filling the otherwise quiet house around me. I ended up fiddling with the TV settings for a bit, and at some point I decided to input my email address into some kind of setup screen or account prompt that had come up on the display. Nothing particularly unusual about that either. Just another small task involved in getting a new television properly connected and set up the way I wanted it, remote in hand as I scrolled through the on-screen keyboard. While I was in the middle of doing this, I suddenly felt something kick the remote control clean out of my hand. It was a genuine physical sensation, not some vague feeling or impression, but an actual forceful kick that knocked the remote entirely out of my grip, sending it clattering somewhere onto the floor beside me. My immediate reaction was to look around the room, assuming that somehow, despite what I had been told, someone else must actually be in the house with me, that maybe the housemate had come back early or a friend of his had let themselves in. There was nobody there. The room was completely empty except for me. As I turned back around after checking my surroundings, I was suddenly punched hard in the chest, the force of the blow sending me stumbling backward until I fell onto a sofa lounge positioned nearby, the impact knocking the breath clean out of me. What followed after that was a genuine physical beating, delivered by something I could only describe as an evil spirit, entirely dressed in black. Its appearance giving the distinct impression that it was wearing some kind of balaclava covering its face, the kind of dark, featureless mask that leaves only the eyes visible. If even that much was visible at all in the low light of the room, its blows landing again and again against me, while I struggled to even properly register what I was looking at. In that moment, completely overwhelmed with fear and genuinely fighting for my own safety, I started saying prayers out loud, switching between Arabic and English as the words came to me, calling on whatever protection I could summon through faith while this thing continued its assault against me, my voice growing louder and more desperate with every single word. As I kept saying those prayers, louder and louder, the beating actually stopped. Once the beating had ceased, I looked around to try to locate exactly where this black spirit had ended up, and it appeared as though it had been physically pushed backward, forced into the corner of the lounge room, as I continued saying my prayers out loud with everything I had left in me, my whole body still shaking from the impact of everything that had just happened to me. Whatever it was, it seemed to be genuinely retreating, pressed back into that corner as though my continued prayers were actively pushing it away from me, holding it at bay while I tried to figure out my next move, my mind racing through every possible option for actually getting myself safely out of that house. Without wasting any more time, I grabbed my man bag from the room where I had originally left it upon moving in, and I ran straight out of that house and into the street outside, not bothering to grab anything else, not even pausing to close the front door properly behind me. I made my way specifically to the one spot on that street where there was an actual working streetlight, the only source of real light anywhere along that entire stretch of road at that hour. Standing there under that light while I called my family members, desperate for someone to come and get me out of there as quickly as possible, my hands still shaking so badly I could barely manage to dial the number properly. My nephew, once he understood what was happening, arranged for a rideshare car to come and pick me up from where I was standing under that streetlight, working quickly to get someone dispatched to my location, despite how confusing and frantic I must have sounded over the phone trying to explain what had just happened to me. Once the car arrived and I got inside, I told the driver directly that I needed to be taken to the hospital, specifically because I knew that at a hospital there would be plenty of people around. In that moment, being surrounded by other people felt like the single most important thing I could possibly arrange for myself. a basic, instinctive need to be somewhere with witnesses. Somewhere that felt fundamentally safe simply because of how many other human beings would be present. Once I arrived at the hospital, I was seen by a doctor, and from there I ended up being placed into a psychiatric ward, where I was scheduled to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. Still shaken and struggling to fully process everything that had happened to me only a short while earlier that same evening. As it turned out, the psychiatrist assigned to my case happened to be Muslim herself. When I explained to her exactly what had happened to me that night, describing the spirit, the physical attack, and the prayers I had used to drive it back, she understood precisely what I was telling her, engaging with my account in a way that felt genuinely validating rather than dismissive, drawing on her own cultural and religious background to actually take seriously what I was describing, rather than simply filing it away as some kind of psychiatric episode disconnected from any real spiritual context, nodding along as I spoke rather than jotting down notes with a skeptical look on her face the way I had half expected. My family members eventually made their way to the hospital to come and get me, and once everything had been sorted out with the hospital staff, they took me back home with them rather than leaving me to return to that share house on my own, which was honestly the very last place I ever wanted to set foot in again after everything that had happened there. My family drove a full 2 hours just to reach the hospital and collect me, meaning they then faced another 2 full hours back on the road afterward. An entire 4-hour round trip undertaken, purely because they wanted to make absolutely sure I was safe and properly looked after following everything that had happened to me that night, dropping whatever they had been doing that day the moment they heard how frightened and shaken I sounded on the phone. My nephews and nieces, the same family members who came out to get me, are the ones I genuinely credit with saving me from that evil spirit, given how quickly and completely they dropped everything to come to my aid the moment they understood what I had actually gone through. Looking back on that entire experience now, I find myself replaying the specific sequence of events over and over, trying to make sense of everything that happened within such an incredibly short window of time, turning each individual moment over in my head as though re-examining it closely enough might finally reveal some detail I had somehow missed the first time through. Signing that lease, thinking I was simply settling into an ordinary new living situation, and then, within only a few short hours, finding myself in a genuine physical struggle against something I still cannot fully explain in any conventional rational terms. The timing alone has always struck me as significant. The fact that whatever attacked me chose that specific window, right after the other housemate had left for his meeting, right as I was alone in the house for what was essentially my very first real stretch of time actually living there. I've thought many times about why that particular spirit, if that is genuinely what it was, chose to reveal itself so violently and so immediately, rather than lingering quietly in the background the way some hauntings apparently do for months or years before ever making direct contact with anyone living in a space, patiently waiting and watching before ever revealing themselves at all. Whatever it was, it did not wait around. It confronted me directly, physically, within hours of my very first time being properly alone in that house, as though it had been waiting specifically for that exact moment, that exact window of isolation, before finally making its presence fully and violently known to me. The physical sensation of that entire encounter has never left me, even now, well after everything actually happened. I remember with total clarity the feeling of the remote being kicked out of my hand, a genuine, forceful, physical sensation that left absolutely no room for me to dismiss it as some kind of static electricity shock or muscle spasm on my own part. And I remember, just as clearly, the punch that sent me stumbling backward onto that sofa, and the beating that followed after that, blow after blow, landing against me from something I could see standing there in front of me, dressed entirely in black. Its face obscured behind what looked exactly like a balaclava, each individual impact still vivid enough in my memory that I can practically feel the ghost of it whenever I let my mind drift back to that night. I have thought a great deal about the specific appearance of that spirit as well, the choice of all black clothing, the balaclava style covering over its face. I do not know why it appeared to me in that specific form rather than some other shape or appearance, but that image has stayed with me in vivid, unwavering detail ever since that night, refusing to soften or blur the way so many other frightening memories eventually do with enough time and distance, staying just as sharp and immediate in my mind today as it was in the very first hours after it actually happened. Turning to prayer in that moment was not something I consciously planned out or decided upon through any kind of clear, rational thought process. It happened instinctively, an immediate, desperate reaching toward the one resource I genuinely believed might actually help me in that moment of pure physical terror, a reflex more than any deliberate decision. Switching between Arabic and English as I prayed felt equally instinctive, drawing on both languages simultaneously without any real conscious decision behind doing so. Simply calling out with everything I had and whatever words came to me fastest in that moment of crisis, the two languages blending together almost seamlessly in my desperation. The fact that the beating actually stopped the moment I began praying out loud has stayed with me as one of the most significant details of that entire night, a fact I return to again and again whenever I try to make sense of everything that happened to me. I do not know for certain whether the prayers themselves were what actually drove that spirit back, or whether the timing was simply coincidental, the attack naturally reaching some kind of conclusion on its own, regardless of anything I happened to be doing or saying in that exact moment. But given how immediately and directly the beating ceased once I started praying, and given how clearly I watched that spirit appear to retreat into the corner of the room as I continued, I have never been able to fully separate those two events in my own mind, the prayers and the retreat, treating them as anything other than directly, causally connected to one another. A connection I have come to trust completely, even without any way of scientifically proving it to anyone else. I think often about that psychiatrist as well, the one assigned to my case once I was admitted to the psychiatric ward, and how genuinely different that entire evaluation process felt specifically because she happened to share my own faith and cultural background, a small piece of fortune I have never taken for granted since. I have wondered more than once how differently that conversation might have gone with a different psychiatrist, someone without that same shared understanding of prayer, of spiritual attack, of the specific significance behind praying in both Arabic and English during a moment of genuine physical danger. Having her specifically assigned to my case felt, in hindsight, like its own small piece of good fortune within an otherwise deeply frightening ordeal, someone genuinely equipped to actually understand and validate what I was describing, rather than simply reducing my entire experience to a clinical diagnosis stripped of any spiritual context whatsoever, something I remain quietly grateful for, even now. I have never gone back to that share house since that night, understandably enough given everything that happened there, not even once, not to collect anything I might have accidentally left behind in my rush to get out. I do not know whether the realtor agent or any subsequent tenants who moved in after me ever experienced anything similar in that same house. And I have never actually reached out to find out, mostly because I have no real desire to maintain any further connection to that property or that specific address at all. Whatever happened in that living room that night I have simply chosen to leave it entirely behind me, moving forward with my life elsewhere, rather than trying to dig any deeper into the history or reputation of that particular house. My family's response to everything that happened has meant more to me than I think I have ever properly been able to express to them directly, even in all the conversations we have had about that night in the time since. The fact that they dropped everything, drove 2 full hours to reach me at that hospital, and then turned right back around for another 2 hours to bring me home with them, without a single moment of hesitation or complaint about the distance or the inconvenience involved, has stayed with me as one of the clearest examples of genuine, unconditional family loyalty I have ever personally experienced in my entire life. My nephews and nieces in particular, the ones who arranged that rideshare and made that entire 4-hour round trip happen without a second thought, hold a permanent, deeply grateful place in my heart because of how quickly and completely they came through for me during what was genuinely one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life. Even now, whenever I think back on that entire sequence of events, signing the lease, the other housemate leaving for his meeting, the television, the remote being kicked from my hand, the punch, the beating, the prayers, the retreat into the corner, the desperate run to the one working street light on that street, the rideshare, the hospital, the psychiatric ward. And finally, my family arriving to bring me home, I am struck by just how completely an entirely ordinary day, one that began with nothing more dramatic than signing a lease agreement, turned into something so genuinely terrifying and so difficult to explain through any conventional, rational framework. The sheer speed of that transformation still leaving me a little breathless whenever I actually sit down and walk through it in order like this. I do not know exactly what that spirit was, or why it chose that specific house, that specific moment in time, or me specifically as its target that particular night. What I do know is that I survived it, that my prayers seemed to make a real, tangible, undeniable difference in stopping it, and that my family came through for me in a way I will never, ever forget for as long as I live. A debt of gratitude I do not think I will ever be able to fully repay, no matter how many years pass between now and that single terrifying night. One day back in 2021, I stayed the night at my aunt's house. The kind of casual overnight visit that happens between family members without much planning behind it. Just a normal night together spent hanging out. The sort of thing we had done plenty of times before without ever thinking twice about it. We spent most of the day just relaxing, sitting around scrolling through our phones, not doing anything particularly exciting or noteworthy. The ordinary, low-key way you spend a lazy day with family when there's nowhere else you really need to be. Occasionally showing each other something funny we had come across, or just sitting together in comfortable silence. Eventually, Once the day wound down, it was time to actually go to bed. I settled in for the night, getting comfortable in the guest room the way I always did whenever I stayed over, and everything felt completely normal right up until I suddenly woke up sometime later to the sound of noises coming from the basement. I honestly cannot fully explain why I decided to actually get up and go check it out myself rather than simply staying in bed and ignoring it. But something about hearing those noises pulled me out of bed and down toward the basement to see what was actually going on. My curiosity or some instinct I could not quite name overriding whatever hesitation I might normally feel wandering around an unfamiliar house in the middle of the night. When I got there and looked around, there was nothing there. No obvious source for the noise, nothing visibly out of place, nothing to explain what I had just heard only moments earlier. Just the ordinary, quiet stillness of a basement at night. Since I could not find anything actually wrong, I decided to just go back to scrolling through my phone for a while, figuring I would settle back down and eventually drift back off to sleep once I felt tired enough again, telling myself it had probably just been the house settling, or some ordinary sound I was not used to hearing in an unfamiliar space. Eventually, I did manage to fall back asleep. That peace did not last, though, because I woke up again a second time that same night. This time, the noises were coming from the bathroom instead of the basement. Hearing this second round of unexplained noise, especially after already having gone to check on the first set, only to find nothing there, completely freaked me out. My heart pounding as I lay there in the dark, trying to decide whether to get up and check again or simply stay put. My aunt heard me reacting and came to check on what was happening, clearly concerned by how shaken I seemed, standing in the doorway of the guest room in her pajamas, asking me what was wrong. I told her everything, walking her through both incidents from that night. The noises in the basement first, and now this second round coming from the bathroom. Her response only made the whole situation feel considerably worse. She told me that when she herself was younger, she had heard those exact same kinds of noises before, in that same house, her voice going quiet and a little distant as she said it, as though she were recalling something she had spent years trying not to think about too closely. Hearing her confirm that this was not some brand new, isolated occurrence, but something that had apparently been happening in that house for a very long time, genuinely terrified me even further. My whole understanding of the night suddenly shifting from a strange, isolated fluke into something with a much longer, more disturbing history behind it. The next morning, when I woke up, I found the basement door standing wide open, even though my aunt was still fast asleep at that point and had not been up and moving around the house herself, at least not that I was aware of. Seeing that door open, with no clear explanation for who or what might have opened it during the night while everyone was supposedly asleep, was more than enough for me. I decided I needed to leave. I did not want to wake my aunt directly to say goodbye in person, so instead I quickly packed up all of my things and left her a short note that simply said, "Leaving, I love you," before heading out of that house entirely, closing the front door quietly behind me and not looking back until I was already well down the street. 3 years later, in 2025, my aunt reportedly heard those exact same noises again. The same ones that had originally happened during my visit, and the same ones she had told me about experiencing herself as a child in that same house. Since that most recent incident, I have not heard from her at all. Not a single message, not a phone call, nothing at all to confirm she is safe and doing well. I genuinely hope she is okay, my sweet aunt, and I think about her constantly, wondering what actually happened and whether she is safe, checking my phone far more often than I probably should in case some message from her finally comes through. Looking back on that entire original night now, years removed from when it actually happened, I find myself replaying every single detail over and over, trying to piece together some kind of coherent explanation for everything that unfolded across those few hours. Going through the sequence again and again as though repetition alone might finally reveal something I had missed. The first set of noises coming from the basement, finding absolutely nothing there upon checking. The second set coming from the bathroom only a short while later. My aunt's unsettling admission that she had experienced the exact same thing herself as a child, growing up in that house, and then, the following morning, discovering that basement door standing open with no explanation for how it had gotten that way, while everyone in the house was supposedly asleep the entire time. I have thought a great deal about why I felt so compelled to actually get up and check on that first set of basement noises myself, rather than simply staying in bed the way most people probably would when hearing something strange in the middle of the night in an unfamiliar house. I do not have a clear answer for that instinct, even now. Only that something about the specific quality of the sound genuinely felt like it demanded investigation, as though some part of me already sensed, even half asleep, that ignoring it entirely was somehow not going to be an option. That whatever was making that noise was not the kind of thing you could simply pull the covers over your head and wait out. Finding nothing down there when I actually went to check only made everything feel more unsettling rather than less, in hindsight. If I had gone downstairs and found some obvious, mundane explanation, a pipe rattling, an appliance cycling on unexpectedly, anything at all that could account for the noise in some ordinary, physical way, I think I would have gone right back to sleep afterward without a second thought, and this entire story would have ended there, forgotten within a week as nothing more than an odd, brief moment during an otherwise unremarkable overnight visit. Instead, finding absolutely nothing left me with this lingering, unresolved unease that never actually settled, sitting with me uncomfortably even as I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone afterward, my eyes drifting back toward the bedroom door every few minutes, just in case. The second round of noises, coming from the bathroom this time, felt even more alarming than the first, mostly because of how quickly it followed right after I had just managed to convince myself that everything was fine and had drifted back off to sleep. Waking up a second time to yet another unexplained sound in a completely different part of the house from where the first noise had originated made it feel considerably less like some isolated one-time fluke and considerably more like something actively moving around the house throughout the night, shifting from one location to another while everyone else was supposedly asleep and unaware, tracking a path through the house that felt disturbingly deliberate, rather than random. My aunt's reaction when I told her everything has always stuck with me as one of the most significant details of that entire night. She did not react with confusion or disbelief the way you might expect someone to react upon hearing a fairly wild-sounding story from a visiting family member in the middle of the night. Instead, she immediately confirmed that she had experienced something very similar herself. Years earlier, during her own childhood spent growing up in that same house, her calm, matter-of-fact tone somehow more unsettling than if she had simply panicked alongside me. That kind of immediate, matter-of-fact confirmation, rather than any hesitation or skepticism on her part, told me clearly that whatever I had experienced that night was not some brand new phenomenon unique to my particular visit, but rather something with an established, ongoing history tied specifically to that house itself. Something my aunt had apparently already made some kind of uneasy peace with over the many years she had continued living there despite everything, having simply learned to coexist with it the way you might learn to live alongside any long-standing unwelcome tenant. Finding that basement door standing open the next morning, With my aunt still fast asleep and clearly not responsible for having opened it herself, was the detail that ultimately pushed me toward actually leaving, rather than simply trying to push through my unease and continue on with a normal visit. I remember standing there, staring at that open door for a long moment, trying to come up with any reasonable explanation for how it could have ended up that way overnight, and coming up completely empty. Doors do not simply open themselves, and with my aunt still asleep and no other explanation available, that open basement door felt like undeniable. Physical confirmation that everything I had experienced during the night had been genuinely real, not some overtired imagination running away with me in an unfamiliar house, a physical trace left behind by whatever had been moving through that house while we both slept. Leaving that note rather than waking my aunt up directly to say goodbye in person has always felt like a strange, somewhat guilty decision in hindsight, though at the time it genuinely felt like the only thing I could manage. I was frightened enough and eager enough to simply get out of that house as quickly as possible that the idea of sitting down and having an actual full conversation with her about everything before leaving felt like more than I could handle in that moment, my hands already shaking as I packed. Writing that short note, leaving, I love you, and then quietly gathering my things and heading out the door felt like the fastest, most manageable way to remove myself from the situation while still leaving her with some acknowledgement of where I had gone and how I felt about her, rather than simply vanishing without any explanation at all. I have thought many times since about whether I should have said something more directly to my aunt before leaving that morning, whether I should have tried harder to convince her to leave that house herself as well, given everything she had told me about her own history with those same noises. I did not push the issue at the time, partly because I was still so young and inexperienced with handling something like this, and partly because it genuinely did not feel like my place to tell an adult family member she needed to abandon her own home based on one frightening overnight visit, regardless of how unsettling that visit had actually been for me personally, especially given how casually she herself had seemed to accept it as simply part of living in that house. Looking back now, especially in light of everything that has apparently happened more recently, I do wonder whether I should have pushed harder, whether there was more I could have done or said that might have changed how things eventually played out for her. That thought has stayed with me, uncomfortable and persistent, in the years since that original overnight visit, especially now that I have not heard from her since she reportedly experienced those same noises again in 2025. A full 4 years after my own original experience in that house. 4 years during which I mostly managed to push the whole memory to the back of my mind, until this most. Recent silence brought it all rushing back. I have reached out to other family members, trying to get any additional information about what might have actually happened to my aunt more recently. But nobody seems to have any clearer picture than I do myself. Everyone I have talked to offering roughly the same vague, uncertain response whenever I bring up the subject. Some family members have suggested she might simply be taking some time away, dealing with something personal that has nothing at all to do with the house or those noises, and I want to hold on to that possibility as much as I can, genuinely hoping that explanation turns out to be the correct one rather than anything more serious or connected to whatever it was we both experienced in that house. Clinging to that hope every time my phone buzzes with a notification that ultimately turns out to be from someone else entirely. But given everything I personally witnessed during that one overnight stay, and given what she told me herself about her own childhood experiences with those exact same sounds, I cannot help but feel a persistent, gnawing worry whenever I think about her, wondering whether whatever moved through that house that night all those years ago has ultimately caught up with her in some way I still do not fully understand, a worry that has only grown heavier with every week that passes without a single word from her. I have also wondered, more than once, about the actual history of that house itself, whether it had been built on land with some kind of troubled past, whether previous owners before my aunt's own family had ever experienced anything similar, or whether whatever was happening in that house had some more specific personal connection to my aunt and her side of the family, rather than being tied to the property itself in any broader sense. I have never actually looked into any of this properly, mostly because I have never felt entirely comfortable digging any deeper into something that already frightened me enough during the single night I actually experienced it firsthand. Part of me is always worried that learning too much more about it would only make the whole situation feel heavier and more real than it already does, without actually bringing me any closer to understanding what happened to my aunt or where she might be now. I have also thought about reaching out to whoever might currently own that house, if it has even been sold in the years since, just to ask whether they have ever experienced anything similar themselves, though I have never actually worked up the nerve to follow through on that idea either. Part of me worries that even asking the question would somehow drag me back into a situation I have spent years trying to keep at a safe distance. And part of me simply does not know what I would even do with the answer if I got one, whatever that answer might ultimately turn out to be. I think about that house often, even now, years after I left it that morning, with nothing more than a hastily written note left behind for her to find. My mind drifting back to it at the strangest, most unrelated moments during an ordinary day. I do not know if I will ever get any real answers about what those noises actually were, why they seemed to move from the basement to the bathroom over the course of that single, unforgettable night, or why that basement door ended up standing wide open the next morning with absolutely no explanation for how it got that way in the first place. What I do know is that my aunt experienced this same unsettling pattern not once, but at least twice across her own lifetime spent in that house. Once as a child, and once again during my visit. And that she has apparently now gone quiet following what sounds like a third occurrence of those same noises in 2025. A pattern that repeats itself just often enough to feel deliberate rather than random. I hold on to the hope that she is simply fine, off dealing with her own personal matters entirely unrelated to anything I experienced or anything she told me about her own childhood in that house. But I also carry, alongside that hope, a persistent, unshakable worry that will not fully leave me alone until I actually hear from her directly myself, confirming with my own ears that she is safe and well. Until that happens, all I can do is keep hoping, keep thinking of her every single day, and keep wishing I had somehow pushed her harder, all those years ago now, to leave that house behind for good the same exact way I ultimately did myself, rather than simply writing a quick note and walking away while she was still fast asleep, unaware that I was leaving at all. My friend and I wanted to go to the zoo after school one particular afternoon. My school is about 10 metro stops from D.C., and during the last week of the school year, we get out really early, giving us plenty of time to actually make the trip and enjoy ourselves before it got too late in the day. The kind of loose, unstructured afternoon that felt like a genuine treat after months of the usual rigid school schedule. My mom's office happens to be close to the zoo, so we had planned on leaving our bags with her while we spent the afternoon looking at the animals and climbing that miserable, steep hill the zoo is famous for, among anyone who has ever visited it on foot before. The kind of hill that leaves you out of breath no matter how many times you have already tackled it in the past. We had just gotten out of the elevator in my mom's office building and were making our way slowly toward the exit planning to head to the metro station, which sat maybe 100 yards away from her office, close enough that we had never once thought twice about walking that stretch entirely on our own. Thinking back on everything that happened next still genuinely makes me feel sick to my stomach, even now, years removed from that particular afternoon. The memory losing none of its intensity, no matter how much distance sits between me and that single terrifying chase. My mom's main office door is one of those revolving doors that force you to walk in a slow circle in order to actually get in or out of the building. The kind of door that always feels slightly awkward to navigate quickly if you are ever in any kind of hurry. I have always been someone who pays close attention to my surroundings, mostly because I read and watch a huge amount of true crime content, which has made me naturally cautious in a way some of my friends probably are not, always scanning a room or a street a little more carefully than most people my age seem to bother doing. I always carry pepper spray with me, and I keep my keys positioned between my knuckles whenever I am out walking anywhere, just in case I ever actually need to defend myself. Small habits I picked up somewhere along the way and have never once questioned dropping since. As soon as we stepped out of the building through that revolving door, I noticed a guy who had just gotten out of what I could only assume was an Uber parked nearby, still standing beside the open car door as though he had only that moment arrived. He looked directly at me and my friend, and his mouth actually fell open, hanging there in this strange, exaggerated way that immediately sent a wave of creeped-out unease straight through me. I tried to ignore that feeling as best I could in the moment, telling myself I was probably just being paranoid or reading too much into an ordinary stranger's odd expression, chalking it up to nothing more than an unusual reaction from someone who had maybe just been startled by something else entirely. Please, if you take nothing else away from this story, never ignore that gut feeling the way I tried to in that moment. My friend and I started walking down the street, deliberately moving away from him, and that was when he started yelling at us, telling us to come back toward him, his voice suddenly loud and demanding in a way that made several other things about him click into place all at once as genuinely threatening. I honestly cannot remember every single word he said, because my fight-or-flight response had already fully kicked in by that point, flooding my whole body with adrenaline and narrowing my focus down to nothing but getting away from him as quickly as possible. But I do remember hearing him say some genuinely disgusting things about my body, and some equally disturbing comments about my friend's hair. I am sure you can imagine roughly the kind of thing he was saying without me needing to spell it out any further. We started running once he got louder and actually began chasing after us down the street, his footsteps pounding the pavement behind us as his voice grew even more agitated and insistent. We crossed the street in an attempt to put more distance between us and him, weaving quickly between a couple of parked cars as we went, and he finally gave up the chase once we sprinted down the very narrow stairs leading into the metro station. Throughout the entire encounter, nobody around us said anything or made any attempt to help us, despite the fact that we were both clearly minors, and both of us looked young even for our actual age. The kind of detail that should have made his behavior even more alarming to anyone watching from nearby. The single most disturbing detail from that entire encounter, the one that has stuck with me more than almost anything else, was the way his mouth fell open the moment he first looked at us, exactly like something out of an old cartoon, like we were the Roadrunner and he was Wile E. Coyote catching sight of his prey for the very first time, that same exaggerated, almost comical expression made genuinely horrifying by the fact that it was happening in real life, directed straight at two teenage girls standing outside an ordinary office building. He was well kept in appearance, with a clean, well-maintained haircut and neat, put-together clothing. Nothing about his outward presentation giving any obvious visual warning of what he was actually capable of, or what he was about to do only moments later. Nothing that would have made either of us think twice about him if we had simply passed him on the sidewalk under any other circumstances. I want to be clear that it is not all men, obviously. But every single time something like this has happened to me or to anyone I know, it has always been a man. Please, please be very careful out there, all of you. Every single one of you reading this right now. Looking back on the whole thing now, with the benefit of hindsight, I sometimes wonder whether I should have done something different in the moment. Whether I should have yelled loudly or caused some kind of scene right there on the street, specifically to draw more attention from the people around us who otherwise did absolutely nothing to help either of us that day. I have thought about that afternoon countless times since it actually happened, replaying the entire sequence of events over and over in my head, trying to figure out if there was anything I could have done differently that might have led to a better outcome, or at least to some kind of intervention from a passerby, rather than the complete silent indifference we actually experienced from everyone else on that street. It genuinely disturbs me, even now, thinking about how many people must have witnessed at least some part of that chase. Two visibly young girls running full speed away from a grown man who was shouting obscene things and actively pursuing us down a public street in broad daylight. And not a single person stepped in, called out, or did anything at all to intervene on our behalf, everyone apparently choosing to either look away entirely or simply keep walking, as though nothing unusual were happening right in front of them. I think about the specific choice we made to cross the street during that chase, a decision that, in hindsight, probably ended up saving us in a way neither my friend nor I fully appreciated in the chaotic, adrenaline-soaked moment it actually happened. Crossing at a distance and forced him to navigate traffic himself if he wanted to keep pursuing us, buying us those crucial extra seconds that ultimately let us reach the metro stairs before he could catch up to either of us. I do not know if either of us consciously decided to cross the street as some kind of deliberate tactical move in the moment, or whether it was simply instinct taking over completely, our bodies making split-second decisions faster than our conscious minds could have ever managed under that level of pure terror. Some deep, animal part of us reacting before either of us had time to actually think anything through. The narrow metro stairs themselves have taken on an almost strange significance in my memory since that day. The specific detail of their narrowness being the very thing that seemed to finally convince him to give up the chase entirely. I have wondered, more than once, whether he simply calculated that following us down into a crowded, enclosed metro station surrounded by security cameras and transit workers was too risky for him to actually attempt, choosing instead to abandon the chase at that exact point, rather than following us any further into a space with considerably less opportunity for him to escape unnoticed. Afterward, weighing his own safety against whatever it was he had been intending to do to either of us up to that point. I have thought a great deal about the specific detail of his appearance, how well kept and ordinary he looked overall. Nothing about his clothing or his neatly styled haircut suggesting anything remotely threatening or genuinely dangerous before he actually opened his mouth and started saying those disgusting things to us that afternoon. That detail alone has stuck with me as one of the most important lessons from the entire experience. The simple fact that genuine danger does not always come wrapped in some obvious, visibly menacing package the way movies and television shows so often like to portray it to audiences. He looked like someone you might easily pass on any ordinary street without a second thought. Someone who could have effortlessly blended into any crowd of otherwise unremarkable people going about their normal day. Right up until the exact moment he revealed exactly what he actually was underneath that ordinary, unremarkable appearance. An appearance that somehow made the whole encounter feel even more unsettling in hindsight than if he had looked visibly dangerous from the very start. My mom, once I told her everything that had happened, was understandably shaken and furious in equal measure, immediately wanting to know every single detail she could get out of me about what the man had looked like, what he had said, which direction he had come from. Anything at all that might help identify him if we ever needed to report the incident properly to the police. She kept asking me the same handful of questions over and over, her hands visibly shaking as she tried to write everything down accurately. We did end up filing a report about the whole thing, though I honestly do not know whether anything ever came of it, given how vague and limited our actual description of him probably was in the end. Having only really registered his general appearance and his terrifying, gaping expression rather than any more specific, identifying details that might have actually helped track him down afterward. The zoo trip itself, the entire original reason my friend and I had even been walking through that part of the city in the first place, ended up feeling like an afterthought compared to everything else that happened that day. We did eventually make it there, once we felt safe enough to actually continue on with our original plan, though I remember spending most of that visit glancing over my shoulder more than actually looking at any of the animals we had originally been so excited to see. My nerves completely shot for the rest of the afternoon, despite technically having escaped the situation without any physical harm coming to either of us, jumping at every loud noise or unexpected movement for the rest of that day. I have talked to my friend about that day more than a few times over the years since it happened, and she remembers it with the exact same vivid, unsettling clarity that I do myself. Neither of us ever having managed to fully shake the memory of it, despite how much time has genuinely passed since we were both still in school together, attending the same classes. We have both talked, more than once, about that specific detail of his mouth falling open the moment he first spotted us, agreeing every single time that it remains the single most disturbing image either of us carries from that entire encounter. An expression that genuinely did look predatory in a way neither of us has ever been able to fully put into words beyond that same cartoon comparison, like watching a predator spot prey it had been specifically waiting for. Some deep, unmistakable recognition passing across his face the moment he laid eyes on us. I think often about how differently that entire afternoon could have ended if we had not immediately started walking away the moment we first felt that creeped-out sensation, or if that metro station had been positioned even slightly further away from my mom's office building, giving him just enough additional time to actually catch up to either of us before we could reach that narrow stairway and disappear down into the safety of the crowded platform below. I do not like to dwell too long on those particular what-if scenarios, but they do resurface in my mind every so often, usually late at night when I am trying to fall asleep, and my thoughts inevitably wander back toward that entire terrifying chase, replaying it with slightly different, considerably worse endings than the one we actually got to experience. Looking back now, I genuinely do believe that trusting my initial gut instinct, even though I tried to talk myself out of it in that first moment outside the revolving door, ultimately played a real role in us getting away safely. If I had ignored that feeling entirely and simply continued on with our original plan without any heightened awareness at all, I do not know whether we would have had the same split-second reaction time once he actually started yelling and chasing after us. That instinct, small and easy to dismiss as it initially felt, turned out to matter enormously once everything else started happening so quickly. The few seconds of heightened alertness it gave me potentially making all the difference between us getting away safely and something far worse actually happening to either of us that afternoon. I have gone back and forth many times over the years since about whether causing a bigger scene in that moment would have actually changed anything about how other people around us reacted, or whether it simply would have made me feel like I had done something, rather than genuinely altering the outcome of that afternoon. There is a part of me that believes screaming loudly enough, making a genuine spectacle of the situation rather than simply running quietly away, might have finally jolted at least one of those silent bystanders into actually stepping forward to help, or at minimum toward pulling out their phone to call for help, or start recording what was happening right in front of them. But there is another part of me that recognizes how genuinely difficult it is to make that kind of calculated, deliberate decision in the middle of overwhelming, all-consuming fear, when your entire body is screaming at you to simply run rather than stop and draw even more attention to yourself from someone who has already made it perfectly clear he intends you harm. Since that afternoon, I have become considerably more deliberate and consistent about the small safety habits I already had in place before it ever happened, treating things like the pepper spray and the keys between my knuckles less as some slightly paranoid quirk and more as an absolutely essential part of how I move through any public space now, even anywhere unfamiliar or particularly quiet. Even during broad daylight in a busy, well-populated part of the city like the one where this whole thing actually happened to us that day. I have also started paying much closer attention to exit routes wherever I happen to go now, mentally noting the nearest place I could duck into for safety, or the fastest possible way to reach some kind of crowd if I ever needed to. A habit I never used to think twice about before that day, but that has become genuine, ingrained second nature to me ever since it all happened. Something I do almost automatically now, without even fully realizing I am doing it in the moment. I want to end this by saying again, as clearly and directly as I possibly can, please never ignore your gut instinct, especially as a young woman moving through public spaces on your own or with friends. That instinct exists for a very real, very important reason, and dismissing it, even briefly, even for what feels like a perfectly reasonable moment of self-doubt, can genuinely cost you those crucial extra seconds you might desperately need if a situation like mine ever actually escalates the way it did for my friend and me that day. Trust it, act on it immediately, and do not wait around trying to convince yourself you are simply overreacting. Because sometimes, genuinely and truly, you are absolutely not overreacting at all. And the real cost of dismissing that feeling even once could end up being far, far higher than any brief, fleeting moment of embarrassment over possibly having misread an entirely harmless situation. I was maybe around 10 years old when this happened. One day, I went up into the attic looking for a toy of mine, even though I never really liked going up there in the first place, since the whole space always struck me as genuinely creepy looking, dim and cluttered in that particular way attics tend to be, full of shadows and boxes and old furniture that never quite got sorted through properly. The kind of space where the single bulb hanging from the ceiling never seemed to quite reach every corner, no matter how bright it was supposed to be. But I wanted that specific toy badly enough that I pushed past my usual reluctance and climbed up there anyway that day, telling myself it would only take a few minutes and I would be back downstairs before I had time to properly get spooked by the place. While I was searching around for the toy, digging through boxes and moving things aside to check underneath, I heard a small noise coming from somewhere behind me. It was faint, nothing dramatic, just a small sound that caught my attention enough to make me turn around and look. Some soft rustle or shift that could have been anything at all in a space that full of boxes and old fabric. When I actually turned to check, there was nothing there at all. Just the ordinary clutter of the attic sitting exactly as it had been a moment before, no obvious source for the sound anywhere I could see. Being a kid, I did not think much of it in that moment. Old houses make all kinds of small, unexplained noises, And at 10 years old, I was not exactly in the habit of assuming every strange little sound meant something sinister was happening. So I simply shrugged it off and turned my attention back to what I had actually gone up there to do. I went back to what I had been doing, continuing to search through some clothes that had been packed away up there, moving hangers and folded piles aside as I looked for wherever that toy might have ended up. My hands moving through the fabric almost on autopilot as my eyes scanned for any glimpse of the toy itself. As I was doing this, I glanced beside me, and that was when I saw it. There was some kind of human-shaped creature standing right there next to me, close enough that it had clearly been there for at least a moment before I noticed it, staring directly at me with an intensity that immediately told my whole body something was deeply wrong. A wrongness I felt in my stomach before my mind had even fully processed what my eyes were actually looking at. I remember the specific details of what it looked like with a clarity that has never faded, even all these years later, every detail as sharp in my memory now as it was in that first terrifying instant. It was completely bald, with barely any hair on its head at all, just patches here and there rather than any kind of full head of hair. The scalp itself visible in places where hair should have been growing in evenly. Its nose looked wrong somehow, not shaped the way a normal human nose should be, too flat or too pinched in a way I could never quite describe properly even to myself afterward. And its teeth looked similarly off, visible in a way that struck me as unnatural, even in that brief glimpse. Too many of them were arranged at some subtly wrong angle. But the detail that has stayed with me more than anything else about its appearance was its eyes. They were simply gone, replaced with pitch black, empty spaces where eyes should have been. No whites, no color, nothing except total, featureless darkness staring back at me from where its eyes were supposed to be. Two holes of absolute black set into an otherwise pale, human-shaped face. Of course, being the terrified 10-year-old girl that I was in that moment, I completely panicked. I did not stop to think, did not stop to look any closer or try to make sense of what I was actually seeing. I turned and ran as fast as my legs could carry me, straight down the attic stairs and away from whatever that thing was, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears the entire way down, taking the stairs two at a time in my desperation to get as far away from that attic as possible. My parents were not home at the time this happened. They had gone out somewhere, leaving my brothers and me at home on our own for a while, the way parents sometimes do when they trust their older kids to look after the younger ones for a short stretch of time. My brothers were both doing their own thing elsewhere in the house at that moment, off in their own rooms or wherever they happened to be, completely unaware of what had just happened to me up in the attic. I did not immediately run to tell either of them what I had seen, too shaken and confused in that first rush of fear to fully process what to do next. And honestly, at 10 years old, part of me was already starting to doubt my own eyes, wondering if I had simply imagined the whole thing in some overactive burst of childhood fear brought on by a space I already found unsettling to begin with. As the day went on and nothing else strange happened, I genuinely started to convince myself that it had just been my imagination running away with me. The natural result of going up into a space I already found creepy and letting my mind fill in something frightening out of shadows and clutter. Kids do that sometimes, I told myself. Spook themselves over nothing and then build the memory up into something bigger than it actually was, exaggerating a half-glimpsed shadow into a fully formed monster out of pure childhood suggestibility. By the time evening rolled around, I had mostly talked myself into believing that explanation, comfortable enough with it that I did not bring it up to my parents once they got home, not wanting to sound silly or overly dramatic about something that was probably nothing at all. especially not in front of my brothers, who would have teased me mercilessly about it for weeks afterward. But then, that same night, as I was lying in my bed trying to fall asleep, everything I had managed to talk myself into believing came crashing back down all at once. I heard footsteps, clear and unmistakable, coming from up in the attic directly above where I was lying. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor up there in a way that left absolutely no room for me to convince myself it was simply the house settling, or some ordinary creak that old houses make at night. Each footstep landing with a weight and rhythm that was unmistakably the sound of something walking rather than any kind of structural settling. Of course, being just as terrified in that moment as I had been earlier that day, I did not get up to check what was making those sounds. I did not call out, did not go find my parents to tell them what I was hearing, did not do anything except lie there completely still in my bed, listening to those footsteps continue overhead, too frightened to move even an inch. I knew, without a doubt, that it could not have been my parents making those sounds. I could hear them clearly, still awake and talking to each other downstairs, their voices carrying up through the house in that ordinary, familiar way parents' voices do late in the evening when kids are supposed to already be asleep. The low murmur of their conversation drifting up through the floor in a way I recognized instantly as coming from well below me rather than above. There was no way they could have been both downstairs talking and simultaneously up in the attic walking around at the same time. And my two brothers, at that particular point in their lives, were the kind of kids who fell asleep almost instantly once they actually went to bed. Deep, heavy sleepers who would not have easily woken up in the middle of the night for any reason, let alone gotten up specifically to wander into the attic, a space neither of them had any real reason to go into at that hour, or honestly at any hour, given that none of us particularly liked spending time up there even during the day, myself included, especially after that afternoon. So there I was, lying in my bed, fully aware that none of the people who should have been in the house that night could possibly account for those footsteps I was hearing directly above me. And yet the sound continued anyway, slow and steady, moving back and forth across the attic floor for what felt like an unbearably long stretch of time before it finally, eventually, stopped. I did not sleep well that night, and I certainly did not go up into that attic again for a very long time afterward, avoiding it as completely as I possibly could, finding excuses whenever anyone asked me to go grab something stored up there, always managing to get someone else to go in my place instead, inventing chores or homework or anything else that would let me redirect the task onto one of my brothers without having to explain exactly why I so badly wanted to avoid that particular space. Even years later, long after that particular incident, I never fully lost the unease that space gave me. A lingering wariness that never quite faded even as I got older and supposedly grew out of childhood fears. The kind of thing where I would still feel my pulse quicken, slightly, just walking past the pull-down attic stairs folded up against the hallway ceiling. I am writing all of this down now with genuinely shaky hands, because even just thinking back on it and putting the details into words brings back that same creeped-out feeling all over again, as vivid now as it was back when I was 10 years old, standing frozen in that attic, staring into those pitch-black, empty eyes. My whole body reacting the same way it did all those years ago, just from typing out the memory in as much detail as I possibly can. And this is far from the only story like this that I have from my life. I have quite a few more experiences along these same lines, all of them completely true as far as I know, all of them leaving me with that same lingering unease whenever I think back on them. A whole collection of strange, unexplainable moments scattered across my childhood that I have never fully managed to make sense of. But this particular one, the creature in the attic and those footsteps that same night, has always stood out to me as one of the most genuinely terrifying things I have ever personally experienced, especially given how young I was at the time and how completely unprepared I was to make sense of what I was actually seeing and hearing. Looking back on it now as an adult, I have tried, more than once, to come up with some kind of rational explanation for what I saw that day in the attic. Children do sometimes see things that are not really there, especially in dim, cluttered, unfamiliar spaces that already carry an unsettling atmosphere before anything strange even happens. And I know enough now about how imagination and fear can combine to create vivid, convincing images out of nothing more than shadows and half-glimpsed shapes. The way a coat hanging on a hook can suddenly look exactly like a lurking figure if your mind is already primed to expect one. But no matter how many times I try to apply that explanation to what happened, it never quite accounts for everything, particularly not for those footsteps later that same night, a detail entirely separate from whatever I might have imagined earlier in the daylight hours up in the attic. A single, brief glimpse of something frightening in a dim, cluttered attic is one thing, easy enough to write off as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination working on a nervous 10-year-old already primed to expect something scary in a space she found unsettling. But footsteps, clear and deliberate, heard later that same night, with every single person who could reasonably have been responsible for making that sound accounted for elsewhere in the house at the exact same time, is an entirely different matter. One that does not fit nearly as comfortably into the same easy explanation, and one that has kept me from ever fully dismissing that whole day as nothing more than a frightened child's overactive imagination. I have thought about telling my parents about all of this over the years since, wondering whether they might remember anything strange about that house themselves. Any history or previous experience with that attic space that might shed some light on what I actually encountered that day. Whether the people who lived there before us might have mentioned anything odd about the place when we first moved in. I never did work up the nerve to bring it up directly, partly out of fear of sounding foolish even now as an adult, worried they might simply laugh it off, or assume I was still holding on to some exaggerated childhood memory that had grown bigger with each passing year, and partly, I think, out of some lingering reluctance to actually dig any deeper into something I have mostly just tried to leave behind me over the years, worried that learning more might somehow make the whole thing feel even more real and even harder to simply file away as an unsolved childhood scare. Whatever that creature actually was, whether some trick of a frightened child's imagination or something else entirely that genuinely existed in that attic alongside us that whole time, I know what I saw, and I know what I heard later that same night. And neither of those two things has ever fully faded from my memory in all the years since. No matter how hard I have occasionally tried to convince myself otherwise during the daylight hours, when everything feels a little more manageable and a little less frightening than it does at night, lying in bed, listening for any sound that might be coming from somewhere it should not be. Even now, as an adult with my own place to live in, I still find myself a little more cautious than I probably should be around attics and crawl spaces in general. Some old, deeply lodged instinct from that one afternoon still quietly shaping how comfortable I feel in spaces like that, decades after it actually happened to me. I know logically, as a fully grown adult now looking back on it, that not every attic is hiding something sinister, that the vast majority of dim, cluttered storage spaces really are exactly as empty and harmless as they appear to be on the surface. But knowing that logically has never quite been enough to fully undo whatever that 10-year-old version of me learned that one particular day, standing frozen next to something with a bald head, wrong teeth, and two pits of pure black where its eyes should have been, and then lying awake later that same night, listening to footsteps overhead that nobody else in the house could possibly have made or explained away. Even now, writing all of this out in detail for what feels like the first time in a long while, I notice my hands are still shaking slightly, the same way they were when I first sat down to put this whole memory into words. A small physical tremor I did not fully expect to still be capable of triggering after all these years of carrying the memory around quietly. There is something about revisiting a fear that specific and that old that never quite loses its grip or its power over you, no matter how many years of ordinary, uneventful life you manage to stack up in between that one afternoon and today. Even the act of describing it now, word by word, brings a strange, physical echo of that same original dread right back with it, as though the memory itself still has teeth. I still cannot fully explain what I saw that day, or what I heard later that same night, and at this point in my life, I have mostly made peace with the fact that I probably never will. That some experiences are simply destined to remain exactly as unresolved as they were the moment they happened, filed away permanently in that strange category of things a person knows happened to them but can never quite prove or fully understand to anyone else, no matter how many times they try to explain it. If nothing else, that afternoon and that night taught me something I have carried with me ever since, quietly. A real and lasting respect for the fact that not every strange thing a person experiences as a child is simply imagination or an overactive mind, and that some memories, however impossible they might sound out loud to anyone hearing them secondhand, deserve to be taken seriously by the person who actually lived through them, even if nobody else around them was there to witness it happening alongside them at the time. This particular incident happened when I was probably around 8 years old. What happened was that I was out playing with my two friends, who I will just call M and T to keep things simple. And the three of us decided to go exploring some of the places we usually messed around in, mostly just because we were bored kids looking for something to do that evening, the way kids in that particular age range often are when there is not much else going on. We ended up at this ditch that I had personally explored plenty of times before, a spot I already knew fairly well from countless other afternoons spent poking around in it. Familiar enough that I could probably have described the layout of it from memory even without actually being there. This time, though, we went at around 8 or 9 in the evening. During a winter afternoon that had already gone fully dark by that hour, the air cold and damp in that particular way winter evenings get once the sun has properly gone down, the kind of cold that gets into your fingers and the tip of your nose within minutes of being outside. We climbed down into the ditch the same way I always had before. But this time, something about it felt different, a little unsettling in a way I could not fully put into words, even though this was far from the first time I had gone down into that ditch at night. I had done it plenty of times previously without ever feeling anything close to what I felt that particular evening. Comfortable enough with the place that I usually did not think twice about heading down there even after dark. But something about that night just sat wrong with me from almost the very first moment we climbed down into it. A heaviness in the air that none of us mentioned out loud at first, though I suspect all three of us were feeling some version of the same thing. We walked a couple of meters further in, and the ditch itself was divided into different sections. Names that I personally had come up with myself back when I was around 6 years old and first started exploring the place regularly, the kind of names only a small child would come up with. Simple and descriptive rather than clever. There was what we called the cut enter, which served as the main entrance point into the ditch. Named that specifically because it was overgrown with nettles you had to push carefully through in order to actually get inside, stinging your arms and legs a little no matter how carefully you tried to avoid them. We made our way through that entrance the same way we always did, pushing past the nettles, and once we got through, we found a doll lying there. It looked completely ordinary. Nothing unusual about it at first glance, just an old, forgotten toy someone had left behind or lost at some point. The kind of thing you might find in any overgrown patch of ground near a residential area, faded and a little dirty from having sat there for who knows how long. But then we kept moving further into what we called the tall nettles section. A name that pretty much explains itself given how overgrown that particular stretch of the ditch always was, with nettles taller than the ones near the entrance. Tall enough in places that they came up past our waists as young kids. It was in that section that we found something considerably more disturbing than the doll. There was a shoe lying there, and it had blood on it, dark stains soaked into the fabric in a way that left absolutely no doubt about what it actually was, even to 3 8-year-olds who had never really seen anything like that up close before. Me, Em, and T were absolutely terrified in that moment, genuinely scared out of our minds by what we were looking at. But after standing there for a moment trying to process it, we ended up having a quick conversation about whether we should keep going further into the ditch or turn back right then and there. We all agreed, somehow, despite how frightened we already were, that we wanted to keep going, some strange combination of childhood bravado and morbid curiosity apparently outweighing the very obvious warning signs already sitting right in front of us. So we kept walking, still within that same tall nettles section, until we came across something else entirely. We saw a limb, a human limb, just lying there in the ditch, pale and unmistakable even in the dim light. All three of us started shaking uncontrollably at the sight of it, and T actually threw up right there on the spot from the sheer shock and horror of it, doubling over among the nettles. I honestly do not know what it was that made the three of us decide to keep walking forward after that. Some combination of shock, morbid curiosity, and maybe just not fully processing yet how dangerous it might be to keep going, but we did keep going anyway, almost as though our legs were moving forward on their own without any real conscious decision behind it. That was when we found it. A body, disfigured and mauled almost beyond recognition, lying twisted in a way that made it clear something violent had happened to it. The face had no eyeballs left in it at all, just empty sockets with blood still pouring out of them, dark and glistening even in the poor light of the ditch. We very nearly lost complete control of ourselves right then and there out of sheer terror, and we got out of that ditch as fast as our legs could possibly carry us, not stopping or looking back even once until we were well clear of the place entirely, scrambling up out of the ditch and running without any real direction beyond simply away. Once we were far enough away and had caught our breath a little, the three of us started talking through what we had just seen, trying to make some kind of sense out of it, even though none of us really had any idea what we were talking about. 3 8-year-olds attempting to reason through something that would have shaken even an adult badly. T thought that maybe someone had smashed the person's face in with a rock based on how damaged everything had looked. M thought it was more likely that someone had used a knife to kill them, cutting rather than crushing. I had a different theory entirely. I thought it looked more like some kind of animal had been responsible, mostly because of the specific pattern of the gashes and wounds we had seen, which looked to me exactly like claw marks. 3 parallel slashes lined up right next to each other in a way that did not look like anything a knife or a rock would leave behind. Too even and too deliberate, looking to be the result of a blunt object. The eyes also had some kind of distinct mark around them that stuck with me as well. Something that similarly did not look consistent with either of my friends' theories about what might have happened. By the way, I should mention that this entire ditch was located in a fairly public area, which is part of what made the whole thing even more shocking to think about afterward. At the time, I remember being genuinely surprised that something like this could have happened in a spot that was not exactly hidden away or isolated from the rest of the world. But then again, the body had also felt warm when we got close enough to notice, which suggested to all of us afterward that whatever had happened to that person had happened fairly recently, possibly not long before we had even arrived at the ditch ourselves that evening. After leaving the ditch behind, the three of us ended up walking into a nearby forest, still shaken from everything we had just witnessed, but trying, in whatever limited way three young kids can manage, to process it and figure out what to do next. None of us quite ready yet to head straight home and try to explain any of this to our parents. At first, nothing in the forest seemed particularly wrong or out of place. Just the ordinary darkness and quiet of trees at night, branches creaking faintly overhead, and whatever small breeze was moving through. But then we heard a sound, a thump. Then, after a pause, another thump, and then another one after that, each one closer than the last, or at least it felt that way in the moment. We turned around to look behind us, and that was when we saw it. A tall, pale creature standing there, with small eyes, an unusually large mouth, and sharp-looking teeth visible even from the distance we were standing at. Its skin looking almost bleached under whatever faint moonlight was filtering down through the trees. The three of us did not wait around to get a better look or figure out what exactly it was. We ran, as fast as we possibly could, putting as much distance between ourselves and that thing as our legs would allow, none of us daring to look back over our shoulders even once during the entire sprint out of that forest. About 2 hours after that entire incident, we ended up passing by this old park nearby, one we sometimes used to hang out at during the daytime when things were normal and none of this had happened yet. A place that had always felt completely safe and unremarkable to us before that particular night. And there, in that same old park, we saw it again. The same tall, pale creature, appearing again in a completely different location from where we had first encountered it in the forest, standing there, just as still and just as silent as it had been the first time. Seeing it a second time was enough to send all three of us running once more, this time straight toward our respective houses, wanting nothing more than to get behind closed doors and away from whatever that thing actually was, none of us stopping to say a proper goodbye to each other before splitting off toward our own front doors. That is essentially where this part of the story ends, though I want to be clear that there is more to it beyond this point, since this was not the complete full account of everything that ended up happening to the three of us afterward. But for now, this covers the initial incident itself, from finding that doll near the entrance all the way through seeing that creature for the second time near the old park, and finally making it home. Looking back on all of this now, as an adult, I still find myself turning the entire sequence of events over in my mind, trying to make sense of pieces that never quite fit together comfortably, no matter how many times I go through them, running the whole sequence back, like a film reel I cannot quite stop replaying. The body itself remains the part that unsettles me the most whenever I actually let myself think about it in detail, especially the specific wounds we saw. Those 3 parallel gashes lined up next to each other in a pattern that none of us, even as kids without much real-world knowledge of injuries or violence, could easily attribute to an ordinary knife or a blunt object like a rock. Claw marks always felt like the most obvious explanation to me in the moment. And honestly, that theory has never really left me in all the years since. Even though I recognize how strange it sounds to seriously suggest that something with claws capable of inflicting wounds like that had been active in a fairly public area that evening, a place families walked through regularly during the daytime, without a second thought. The missing eyes have also stuck with me powerfully over the years. more than almost any other single detail from that entire night. There was something about the specific way the blood had pooled and dried around those empty sockets that has never fully left my memory. An image that resurfaces every so often even now, decades removed from actually witnessing it, usually arriving completely unprompted at the strangest, most unrelated moments. I have wondered more than once whether whatever attacked that person specifically targeted the eyes for some deliberate reason, whether that detail meant something significant about the nature of whatever we ultimately encountered later that same night in the forest and again at the park, or whether it was simply one particularly gruesome detail among many others in an already horrific scene, no more significant on its own than any of the other wounds. I think about the timing of everything constantly as well, how the body had still felt warm to the touch when we got close enough to notice, suggesting we had arrived at that ditch only shortly after whatever happened to that person had actually taken place, possibly only minutes beforehand, given how fresh everything about the scene had looked. That detail alone has always left me with a lingering unease. The uncomfortable realization that whatever was responsible for that mauling might have still been somewhere nearby, watching us, while we were still standing there, looking down at the body ourselves, completely unaware at the time of just how close we might have actually been to real, immediate danger ourselves. And then there is the creature itself, the tall, pale figure with small eyes and that unnervingly large mouth full of sharp teeth. Seeing it once in the forest would have been more than enough to leave a permanent mark on any of us, but seeing it again, barely 2 hours later, in a completely different location entirely. At that old park we used to spend so much ordinary time at during daylight hours, made the whole experience feel considerably less like a single, isolated random encounter, and considerably more like something that had actually been following us, deliberately, the entire time between those two sightings, tracking our movements through the dark with a patience that still unsettles me to think about now. I have talked about that night with both M and T over the years since, whenever we happen to still be in touch and the subject comes up between us. And none of us has ever managed to arrive at a satisfying explanation for any of it, the body, the wounds, or the creature itself, no matter how many times we have gone back over the details together as adults, with considerably more life experience than we had that night. Each of us still holds on to our own original theory about what caused those wounds, T still leaning toward the idea of a rock, M still convinced it must have been a knife, and me still holding firm to my belief that whatever did that to that poor person had claws rather than any kind of man-made weapon. None of us has ever been able to convince the others to fully abandon our own particular theory, and at this point, I doubt any of us ever will, since none of us actually witnessed the attack itself happening, only its horrific aftermath, leaving each of us to fill in that missing piece with whatever explanation feels most plausible to us individually. I have never gone back to that ditch since that night, not once, despite having grown up not too far from it, and having plenty of reason over the years to walk past that general area again. I always find some way to take a different route, even if it means going noticeably out of my way, unwilling to risk laying eyes on that spot again, even now, decades removed from actually finding that body there. M&T have both told me they feel the same way about it. That particular stretch of ground, carrying a weight for all three of us that no amount of time seems capable of fully lifting. I sometimes wonder whatever happened with that body afterward, whether anyone else ever found it, whether it was ever identified, whether whoever that person was ever got some kind of resolution or justice for whatever happened to them that night. As a kid, I never told a single adult about what we had actually seen down there, too frightened and too overwhelmed in the moment to think clearly about what the responsible thing to do might have been. And by the time I was old enough to properly understand the weight of that decision, far too much time had passed for me to feel like coming forward with it would actually accomplish anything beyond dredging up a memory I had mostly managed to keep buried. I do not know if that was the right choice or not, and it is something I still think about from time to time, even now, wondering whether I owed that person, whoever they were, something more than simply running away and trying to forget. What I can say with complete certainty, even all these years later, is that whatever we saw that night in the ditch, and whatever that pale, sharp-toothed creature actually was, that we encountered twice within the same 2-hour window. None of it has ever fully faded from my memory, and I doubt it ever fully will. It remains, even now, one of the single most disturbing and genuinely frightening experiences of my entire childhood, made all the more unsettling by the fact that there is genuinely more to this story beyond what I have already described here. Additional details and events that happened afterward that I have not even gotten into yet, saved instead for another telling entirely. A few years ago, a friend of mine asked me to look after a lighthouse for him, one located on a small island somewhere near Alaska. At the time, I was living in Owensboro, Kentucky, so taking on this favor meant I had to fly all the way out there just to handle it. It was the kind of request you do not really turn down for a good friend, even when it means a fairly long trip, for what amounted to only a couple of days of actual work. He explained that his usual arrangement for someone to watch over the place had fallen through unexpectedly at the last minute, and he was in a bit of a bind trying to find someone he trusted enough to step in on such short notice. I did not think twice about agreeing, given how much he had done for me over the years and how rarely he ever actually asked me for anything at all in return. Always the one offering favors rather than requesting them. I decided against bringing my dog along with me on this particular trip, even though he usually comes with me whenever I travel anywhere for more than a day or two, since he tends to get anxious being left with anyone besides me for too long a stretch of time. Since this was only going to be a quick 2-day stay, I figured it made more sense to leave him at home with someone else looking after him, rather than dragging him along on a long flight and an even longer drive for such a short stretch of time. Looking back now, that decision has taken on a strange kind of significance in my mind, given everything that ended up happening. Though at the time, it felt like nothing more than ordinary practical planning, the kind of small logistical choice you make without giving it a second thought. Once my plane finally landed, I still had a fair amount of traveling left ahead of me before I would actually reach the lighthouse itself, my legs stiff from the long flight, and eager for a chance to actually stretch out and move around after so many cramped hours in a middle seat. I rented a car at the airport and drove for about 2 hours to reach the docks, where I was supposed to use my friend's boat to actually get out to the island where the lighthouse was located. The drive itself was long and mostly uneventful, winding through a lot of remote, sparsely populated stretches of road, the kind of drive where you go a good while without seeing much of anything except trees and open land. The radio fading in and out of static the further I got from any real town, until eventually I just gave up, trying to find a clear station, and drove the rest of the way in silence. Once I reached the docks, I got my friend's boat ready and made my way out across the water to the island. It was not an especially long trip by boat, but it was enough to really drive home just how isolated this particular spot was going to be for the next couple of days. Water stretching out in every direction, with barely any other signs of civilization visible from where I was sitting. No other boats passing by, no distant lights along the shoreline, just gray water and an equally gray sky pressing down close overhead. The whole scene almost unnervingly quiet, apart from the low hum of the boat's own engine. I arrived at the island and pulled up to a small wooden platform that led up to a set of stairs, which in turn led up to the lighthouse keeper's house itself. The platform itself looked well maintained despite its age, sturdy enough underfoot even though the wood had clearly weathered plenty of harsh seasons out there exposed to the elements, salt and wind having bleached it to a pale gray over what must have been many years of standing out there facing the open water. The house turned out to be genuinely cozy once I got inside and settled in. Decorated with a handful of pillows scattered around, a proper bed, a couch that looked like it had seen plenty of use over the years, and a small television that looked like it had probably been purchased sometime in the early 2000s, the kind of boxy, outdated set you do not see much of anymore. The bathroom was on the smaller side, nothing especially fancy, but it was more than adequate for a stay that was only ever supposed to last 2 days. Everything about the place had a kind of lived-in, well cared for quality to it. The sort of space that clearly meant something to whoever had actually spent real time out there over the years maintaining it. Small personal touches scattered here and there that made it feel less like a plain functional outpost and more like an actual home someone had genuinely cared about. The first day went smoothly enough, all things considered. I did not run into any particular problems worth mentioning, settling into the rhythm of the place fairly easily, unpacking my things and getting a feel for the general layout of both the house and the surrounding grounds. My friend had left me a chore list to work through during my stay, mostly straightforward tasks, making sure the tower itself was still functioning properly the way it was supposed to, cleaning up the outdoor deck area, and tidying up the bed and general living space inside the house. Nothing on that list struck me as particularly difficult or time-consuming, the kind of light maintenance work you would expect from watching over a lighthouse for a short stretch while the regular caretaker was away, and I managed to work through most of it within the first few hours of arriving, leaving myself with a comfortable amount of free time for the rest of the day. At some point that first day, sometime around noon or maybe 12:30, I found myself with a bit of downtime and decided I wanted to watch a movie to pass the time. I ended up choosing the 2009 remake of Friday the 13th, since it had only been released a couple of years earlier at that point, and I had been meaning to actually sit down and watch it properly for a while, having heard mixed things about it from friends, but never quite getting around to seeing it for myself. I settled onto the couch, put the movie on using that old television, adjusting the antenna slightly to get a cleaner picture, and got fairly absorbed in it as the afternoon went on, the isolated setting of the film itself feeling almost fittingly appropriate, given where I was actually sitting to watch it. The movie was nearly finished, getting close to its ending, when I stood up to go use the bathroom, which, as I mentioned earlier, was actually located outside the main house itself, rather than being attached directly inside. I stepped outside, made my way to the bathroom, took care of what I needed to take care of, and then headed back out to return to the house and finish watching the last stretch of the movie. It was right as I stepped back outside from the bathroom that I noticed something that immediately made my entire body go cold. There was a figure standing up in the tower of the lighthouse itself, visible from where I stood outside the bathroom, clearly positioned somewhere up near the top of the structure, silhouetted just enough against the gray afternoon light that I could make out its general human shape without being able to pick out any specific details of its face or clothing. This immediately struck me as deeply wrong, because I was supposed to be completely alone on that island for the full 2 days of my stay. Nobody else was scheduled to be there. My friend had made that point very clear before I ever agreed to take this on, that the whole reason he needed someone to come out and handle things personally was specifically because the place would otherwise be sitting there completely unattended and empty, with no other staff, no other visitors, nothing beyond myself, for the entire duration of the assignment. Seeing that figure standing up in the tower, in a spot where absolutely nobody should have been, sent me into an immediate, full-blown panic. I did not stop to think logically about what I should actually do, did not consider trying to get a closer look or figure out who or what it actually was, did not even consider calling out to it to ask who was up there. I simply ran, as fast as I possibly could, straight down to where the boat was tied up at that small wooden platform, and I got that boat moving away from the island as quickly as I could manage, my hands shaking so badly I nearly fumbled the engine on my first attempt to start it. I was in such a state of panic that I did not even think to grab any of my belongings from inside the house before fleeing, leaving behind my bag, my clothes, and everything else I had brought with me for the trip, none of that registering as important compared to simply getting away from that island as fast as humanly possible. Once I was back on the mainland and had enough distance between myself and that island to actually start thinking clearly again, my hands still trembling against the boat's wheel the entire ride back, watching the island shrink steadily behind me until it was nothing more than a distant shape against the water. I reported everything that had happened, both to my friend directly and to the local authorities, wanting to make sure someone official was aware of what I had seen out there. Unfortunately, neither my friend nor the authorities seemed to take what I had told them particularly seriously. If anything, I got the distinct impression that both of them thought I had simply lost my mind or panicked over nothing, seeing shadows or some trick of the light and blowing it completely out of proportion in my head. The officer who took my statement kept his tone polite the entire time, nodding along and jotting things down in his notebook. But I could see it in his eyes, that quiet, patient look people give you when they have already decided your story is not something they need to actually act on. My friend did eventually get my belongings back to me somehow, arranging to have someone else go out and retrieve my things from the house so I would not be left without any of my stuff. My bag showing up at my door about a week later with a short, somewhat clipped note attached that thanked me for my help, but did not mention anything at all about what I had reported seeing. But since that entire incident, I have not actually seen or spoken to him in person again, our friendship having drifted apart in a way that I cannot help but partially attribute to how that whole situation played out between us. I genuinely just wanted to put this story out there for other people to read and see for themselves. Since I know exactly how it sounds and exactly how unlikely people are to believe me, the same way my friend and the authorities clearly did not believe me at the time. But I know what I saw standing up in that tower that afternoon, and no amount of disbelief from anyone else has managed to change my own certainty about that. Even now, when I try to recall the exact details of that figure, I find myself frustrated by how little I can actually confirm about it beyond the basic shape and posture. It was too far away and too poorly lit for me to make out a face, clothing, or any other identifying feature, and everything happened fast enough, both the sighting itself and my own immediate panic afterward, that I never had the chance to look more carefully even if some part of me had wanted to. All I really have is the shape of it, upright, still, unmistakably human in its general form, standing exactly where no human should have been able to stand. I have wished more than once that I had simply frozen for even a few extra seconds instead of running immediately, if only to gather some additional detail that might have helped me make more sense of it afterward, though I also understand completely why my body reacted the way it did in that moment, prioritizing escape over observation, the way any reasonable person's instincts would under those exact circumstances. Looking back on the whole experience now, with the benefit of some real distance and time to think it over, I find myself replaying the details of that day constantly, trying to figure out if there was anything about the situation I might have misread or misunderstood in the heat of the moment. The timing of it has always struck me as particularly strange, given that I had just finished watching a horror movie about a masked killer stalking an isolated location, only to step outside afterward and immediately spot an unexplained figure in a place where nobody should have been. Part of me has wondered, more than once, Whether the movie itself had simply put me in the wrong headspace, primed my nerves in exactly the way horror movies are designed to do, and made me interpret some ordinary shadow or trick of the afternoon light as something far more sinister than it actually was. My brain simply supplying a threatening human shape, because that was exactly the kind of image the film had been feeding me for the past 90 minutes. But no matter how many times I try to talk myself into that explanation, it never quite holds up under real scrutiny. The figure I saw was not some vague, ambiguous shadow that could be explained away as a trick of the eye. It had a clear, distinct human shape to it, standing upright, positioned specifically within the tower itself in a spot that would have required actually climbing up there, navigating whatever stairs or ladder led to that particular section of the lighthouse. That is not the kind of detail your mind conjures up out of nothing more than an overactive imagination primed by a scary movie. Someone or something would have needed to physically be up there, in a location I had specifically been told would be completely empty and unoccupied for the entire duration of my stay. A location that, as far as I understood at the time, was not even easy to reach without knowing the specific layout of the tower's internal stairwell. I have thought many times since about what might have actually happened up there. What that figure could have been if it genuinely was not simply my imagination running away with me in a moment of heightened nerves. Could someone else have somehow gotten onto that island without my knowledge, perhaps arriving by their own boat while I was distracted inside watching the movie, climbing up into the tower for reasons I cannot even begin to guess at? That explanation feels almost as strange and unsettling as any supernatural one might. Honestly, the idea of a total stranger deliberately making their way onto a remote island specifically to climb up into an unoccupied lighthouse tower while someone else was staying there, timing their arrival precisely enough that I never once heard an approaching boat engine over the sound of the movie playing inside. Or was there something else about that lighthouse and that island that I simply was not told about beforehand? Some history or reputation attached to the place that my friend either did not know about himself or, for whatever reason, chose not to share with me before I agreed to go out there and take care of things for those 2 days? I have wondered about that possibility more than once, particularly given how oddly things played out afterward between my friend and me, the strange distance that grew between us following that incident, despite how close we had been before it happened. A coldness that crept into our conversations almost immediately and never really thawed back out again, no matter how many times I tried reaching out afterward. I want to be clear that I do not think my friend deliberately sent me somewhere dangerous or lied to me about anything specific. I have no real reason to believe that, and nothing about how he generally treated me, before or after this incident, suggests any kind of deliberate deception on his part. But I have still found myself wondering, in the quiet moments when this whole memory resurfaces unprompted, whether there might have been something about that particular lighthouse that he simply never thought to mention. Some detail he considered unimportant, or that he genuinely was not even aware of himself, having likely never personally experienced anything unusual there during his own time watching over the place. Perhaps because whatever was up there simply never revealed itself to him the way it apparently did to me. The distance that grew between us afterward has always bothered me more than I initially expected it to. We had been close enough friends beforehand that he trusted me specifically to take care of something as important to him as that lighthouse, entrusting me with a task that clearly meant something to him personally, whether out of practical necessity or some deeper attachment to the place itself, an attachment I never fully understood the source of, even when we were still close. And yet, once I came back from that trip with my story about the figure in the tower, something between us simply never quite recovered. I do not know whether he genuinely believed I had lost my composure over nothing and quietly judged me for it ever since, or whether some other, more complicated reaction was happening on his end that he never fully explained to me directly. Some private knowledge of his own about that lighthouse that my story had accidentally brushed up against in a way he was not prepared to address. Either way, our friendship never really continued on the same footing it had been on before that trip, drifting apart gradually over the following months until we simply stopped being in regular contact with each other at all, our messages growing shorter and further apart until they eventually stopped altogether. I also think often about the authorities' reaction when I reported what I had seen. The way they listened to my account with what I could only describe as polite disbelief, going through the motions of taking my statement without ever seeming to genuinely consider that I might be telling them something real. I understand to some degree why that would be their default reaction. A remote island lighthouse, an unexplained figure glimpsed briefly from a distance, a caretaker who fled the scene in a panic without even stopping to grab his own belongings. All of that does sound, on its surface, exactly like the kind of story someone might tell after simply spooking themselves badly enough to lose all sense of proportion. I do not blame them entirely for reacting the way they did, even though it left me feeling deeply frustrated and unheard at the time, wishing at least one person in a position of actual authority had taken what I said seriously enough to look into it further, rather than simply filing it away as an overreaction. What continues to bother me most, even now, years removed from the actual incident, is the fact that I never went back to that island to check things out for myself once I had calmed down and had time to think more clearly. I understand exactly why I did not, given how genuinely terrified I was in that moment and for a good while afterward. But some part of me has always wondered what I might have found if I had actually worked up the nerve to return, whether there would have been any physical trace at all of whatever or whoever I saw standing up in that tower. Footprints somewhere, some sign of another boat having been there, anything at all that might have finally given me some concrete answer one way or the other. Even now, I sometimes catch myself wondering whether I still could, whether enough years have passed that I might finally have the nerve to charter a boat out there myself and simply look. Though every time I actually consider it seriously, the same old fear comes rushing back, and I find some reason to talk myself out of it all over again. Instead, I am left with nothing but my own memory of that afternoon, a memory that has never faded or softened with time, the way I might have expected an isolated, unverified incident to eventually fade. If anything, thinking back on it now feels almost exactly as vivid and unsettling as it did in the moment itself. The image of that figure standing motionless up in the tower burned into my memory with a clarity that surprises me every single time I revisit it. Every detail of that gray afternoon light and that still upright shape returning to me almost exactly as sharp as it was the very first time. I have told this story to a handful of people over the years since it happened, mostly close friends and family members who I trust enough to share something like this with, expecting at least some of them to react the same way my original friend and the authorities did, with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. And while a few people have indeed reacted that way, several others have taken it far more seriously than I expected, offering their own theories or simply sitting with the story quietly, acknowledging how genuinely unsettling it sounds without immediately trying to explain it away, which I have always appreciated more than I probably let on at the time. A few people I have told this story to over the years have brought up the possibility that lighthouses themselves, given their long history and their frequent association with isolation, shipwrecks, and tragic accidents, involving the keepers who used to maintain them long before automation took over most of these duties. often carry their own reputations for being haunted or otherwise unsettling places. I did not know much about the specific history of that particular lighthouse before agreeing to watch over it for my friend, and I have never actually gone back to look into whether it carried any kind of history along those lines, whether any previous keeper had died there under strange circumstances, or whether local stories from that part of Alaska mentioned anything unusual about that specific stretch of coastline or that specific island. Part of me has always been curious enough to want to look into it properly, and part of me has simply never wanted to know badly enough to actually follow through and start digging. Some instinct telling me that whatever I might find would only make the whole memory harder to live with rather than easier. I think, if I am being completely honest with myself, that not knowing has become its own strange kind of comfort over the years. If I never actually confirm anything definite about that lighthouse's history, I get to hold on to the possibility that what I saw really was simply a trick of overactive nerves and bad timing. A horror movie's influence bleeding into an ordinary, isolated afternoon in a way that made an entirely mundane shadow look like something far more sinister than it actually was. But if I ever did look into it properly and found something concrete, some documented history of tragedy or strange occurrences tied to that exact location, I am not sure I would be able to hold on to that comforting possibility any longer, and I am not sure I actually want to give that particular comfort up, even knowing how thin and fragile it probably is. Even now, whenever I happen to watch any movie set in an isolated location, a cabin in the woods, a remote research station, anything involving characters trapped somewhere far from help, I find myself thinking back to that afternoon on the island, remembering exactly how the quiet stillness of that place had started to feel different somehow in the hours leading up to when I actually saw that figure. Though at the time I had chalked up any unease I felt purely to the movie I happened to be watching rather than anything genuinely wrong with my surroundings. Looking back, I wonder now whether that creeping unease I felt throughout the day was actually some kind of early warning that something was not right. Some instinct picking up on a presence I would not consciously register until I stepped outside and saw it directly with my own eyes. Some quiet, animal part of my brain trying to warn me well before the rest of me was ready to listen. I have also thought, more than once, about how differently that entire day might have gone if I had brought my dog along with me after all, despite deciding against it, given the short length of the trip. Dogs tend to notice things long before people do, reacting to sounds, smells, or presences that remain completely invisible and undetectable to human senses. I have wondered whether he would have started acting strangely at some point earlier in the day, growling at something in a direction I could not identify, refusing to settle down the way dogs sometimes do when they sense something is wrong well before their owners ever catch on. Pacing near the door or staring fixedly at some empty corner of the room for reasons I would never fully understand. Maybe having him there would have given me some earlier warning that something was off about that island. Some chance to leave before things escalated to the point of actually seeing that figure directly. Or maybe it would have made no difference at all, and I am simply looking for some alternate version of that day where things might have gone differently. Some way to feel like I had more control over the situation than I actually did. Some comforting fantasy where a different decision might have spared me the whole ordeal entirely. Regardless of what actually happened out there, whether it was an intruder, some trick of light and shadow amplified by a scary movie and an isolated, unfamiliar setting, or something else entirely that defies any easy explanation, I know that the experience changed something in me permanently. I do not take solitary trips to remote locations nearly as casually as I once did, and I find myself, even now, instinctively checking over my shoulder a little more often than I probably need to, whenever I find myself somewhere quiet and isolated, some small, permanent residue of that single afternoon still lodged somewhere in the back of my mind, refusing to fully let go no matter how much time continues to pass, resurfacing at the smallest, most unexpected reminder, an unfamiliar creak in an old house, a tall shape glimpsed at a distance in poor light, a silhouette against an overcast sky. I do not know if I will ever get any real answers about what actually happened that day. Whether that figure was human, something else entirely, or nothing at all beyond my own overactive nerves interacting badly with an unfamiliar setting and a poorly timed horror movie. But I know what I saw, standing there, just outside that small outdoor bathroom, looking up at the lighthouse tower and seeing something that should not have been there at all. And no matter how many people have doubted me since, no matter how thoroughly my own friend and the local authorities dismissed what I told them, I have never once doubted my own memory of that moment. Not for a single second. Not in all the years since it actually happened. I still think about that lighthouse fairly often. More often than I probably should, given how much time has passed since that afternoon. I wonder sometimes whether whoever ended up taking over the caretaking duties after my friend and I drifted apart has ever experienced anything similar out there. Whether they simply never mentioned it the same way I suspect my friend himself may have chosen not to mention something to me, or whether that tower has stood completely quiet and uneventful ever since. It's one strange afternoon reserved specifically for me and nobody else who has passed through since. I suppose I will probably never know the answer to that either. One more loose thread in a story that has never fully tied itself off, no matter how many times I have gone back over every detail of it in my own head, searching for some conclusion that never quite arrives. Some final piece that would let me finally set the whole memory down and stop turning it over again and again the way I still find myself doing. Even now, all these years later, whenever the subject happens to come up, or whenever I catch some small, unrelated detail that reminds me, just for a moment, of that gray afternoon and that still, upright shape, standing exactly where nothing should have been standing at all.